Around 68 million years ago, something massive was patrolling the vast open plains and wide skylines of America. Over the heads of the mighty titanosaurs flew the titanosaur equivalent of a pterosaur, the colossal Quetzalcoatlus. This is an animal almost incomparable to anything alive in the 21st century, with its long snaking neck, giant wings, and long sharp beak. It survived ultimately to the end of the Mesozoic era, around the time the end Cretaceous extinction marked the end of all non-avian dinosaurs the world over. It would go on to surrender the skies to the birds of the Cenozoic era, where it was succeeded by the giant pelagornids and teratorans, huge birds with wingspans larger still than anything alive today. As big as these huge birds were able to grow, though, none of them could match the sheer size of Quetzalcoatlus, the largest flying animal ever to exist on planet Earth. In today's video, we will be exploring the life of this colossal pterosaur, everything from the way it lived and how it looked, right up to the point it was discovered and described over 60 million years later. We will take a look at the environment in which Quetzalcoatlus lived, the different species within the genus, and the controversies surrounding its discovery. Sit back and relax as we take flight with a true giant of the skies. Towards the Cretaceous period, pterosaurs saw their evolutionary opportunity to blossom out into many strange new forms, unlike anything else the world has ever seen. Tiny bat-like pterosaurs fluttered around the forests at night. Filter-feeding pterosaurs sifted invertebrates from mudflats and lakesides. Ocean-going giants plucked fish from the waves as they soared, some of which were the proud owners of the most elaborate display crests used for signaling and attracting others of the same species. Some pterosaurs, however, went above and beyond in terms of size, the Azhdarchids. Among the Azhdarchids were pterosaurs both big and small, but some genera within the family were the largest flying creatures ever to take to the skies. The most famous of these, and the subject of today's video, was Quetzalcoatlus, the largest of the pterosaurs. Now we will go into the specifics regarding the diversity between the known species of Quetzalcoatlus shortly, but one important thing to note is the sheer size of Quetzalcoatlus northropi. This airborne colossus could reach over 8 meters from the tip of its beak to the end of its claws when stretched out in the sky, with a total wingspan of a whopping 11 meters on average. Early estimates put the animal's wingspan anywhere between 15 and 21 meters in width. But even with the current average, it's still the largest flying animal ever to take to the skies. Quetzalcoatlus northropi will be the main focus of today's video, but we will also explore the whole genus in detail. But what did such a creature look like? Quetzalcoatlus species were some of the strangest animals in the Mesozoic, like many other species of Azhdarchid. These pterosaurs are like nothing else the world has ever seen. Modern reconstructions in paleoart have captured these reptiles in a wide range of poses, stances, and forms, but none of them are particularly recognizable against what the general public would think of as a pterosaur. When depicted on the ground, Quetzalcoatlus was particularly un-pterosaur-like. Walking on all four limbs, with the wings folded up and held out in front of it, it would have held its body upright like a modern bird. The long, thin legs would have stretched out behind it, which were mainly used for balance. The bulk of the animal's musculature could be found in the forelimbs, which were used to heave the animal forward on the ground. The incredibly long neck would usually have been held aloft, high above the creatures of the ground. In fact, when the pterosaur stood at its full height, with its neck held up, it would have been roughly the same size as a modern giraffe. Atop the neck was an incredibly large skull, with a long, sharp beak. This would have given it a superficial resemblance to a modern stork, such as Africa's marabou stork, whose beaks were very similar as a result of convergent evolution. Paleontologists know for a fact that Quetzalcoatlus species possessed a crest of some kind, but the exact structure of this is not currently known. Many modern depictions of Quetzalcoatlus show the animal with a generally short, rounded crest structure at the back of the skull. But perhaps further excavations and discoveries will eventually shed some light on this. In flight, the animal would have been very different. As the pterosaur took to the sky, using its massive limbs to push itself off the ground, it would have begun to initially hold its arms outstretched, revealing its amazing wingspan. Flapping those massive wings would have assisted it in gaining initial height in the air, before leveling out and soaring on air currents like a vulture. When in the air, the body would have been held horizontally, with the neck outstretched far in front of it. The thin hind limbs would have trailed behind the animal, with a thin stretch of skin creating a mini wing-like structure towards the tail to permit the animal extra control in the air. It must have been a breathtaking sight when airborne. Most birds, when migrating, fly at a height between 200 and 1,500 meters. We can usually still see these animals very visibly, depending on the species and height. And all birds alive today are exceptionally smaller than the average Quetzalcoatlus northropi. Imagine then what it must have been like to see something as large as this giant pterosaur, soaring through the clouds high above the trees, 11-meter wingspan blocking out the sun, carrying an animal as tall as a modern-day giraffe. The degree of variation and size differences between creatures of the Mesozoic is truly awe-inspiring. Quetzalcoatlus fossils are known most familiarly from Texas, United States. In southwest Texas lies the Big Bend National Park, an 801,000-acre national park on the border with Mexico that spans across the Chihuahuan Desert and the Rio Grande River. Some of the rocks that cover the region compose the Javelina Formation, which are a dark brownish red in color. These are sediments containing fossils that date back to the Maastrichtian age of the Cretaceous period, the final segment of the Mesozoic, before the Chicxulub meteor came crashing down to mark the end of the very last of the dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and giant marine reptiles. The first Quetzalcoatlus fossils were unearthed in 1971 from a geology student from the Jackson School of Geosciences at Texas University by the name of Douglas A. Lawson. Undertaking an expedition into the Javelina Formation, Lawson was quick to uncover very peculiar bones emerging from the Maastrichtian sediments. Initially, he was searching for the bones of titanosaurs that were common throughout the location in order to study dinosaurs such as Alamosaurus, a gigantic sauropod and one of the last dinosaurs to live. Instead, he found a wing bone, a colossal wing bone. Such a bone was unknown to science at the time. Pterosaurs were familiar from other locations across the world, but none of this size. Lawson didn't report his discoveries officially until 4 years later in 1975. Ever since then, Quetzalcoatlus has been the largest flying animal ever to live, and the fossils have challenged much of what biologists and paleontologists know about animal flight. But we'll cover that in further detail later in this video. Upon Lawson's first description of Quetzalcoatlus, he was met with superstition and controversy. One of the researchers from the same team rejected his initial size proposals of the wing bones, claiming that they were inconsistent with the dimensions of modern-day bird wings. Lawson then noted that Quetzalcoatlus was studied based on existing pterosaurs of a smaller size, which is pretty much airtight as far as modern paleontology goes. Quetzalcoatlus really was this big, and it really did exist with the proportions and dimensions eventually settled upon by Lawson. As of the time this video was made, there are 2 species of Quetzalcoatlus. Quetzalcoatlus northropi, the undisputed giant of the skies, and Quetzalcoatlus lawsoni, a much smaller species which became known to science in 2021, long after Quetzalcoatlus northropi was initially described in 1975. Remains of Quetzalcoatlus lawsoni, about half the size of its much larger cousin, were actually uncovered from late Cretaceous sediments at the same time as Quetzalcoatlus northropi, and at the time were assumed by paleontologists to be juvenile forms of the original species. However, as more and more bones have been unearthed over time, including at this point an almost complete skeleton, consisting of well-preserved wing bones, hind limbs, vertebrae, and skull fossils, subtle differences have become visible in the bone structures and lengths. As with many paleontological subjects, there is much debate surrounding Quetzalcoatlus's status in taxonomical terms. The first Quetzalcoatlus northropi bones to be discovered in 1975 were not accurately and efficiently described until the revelations surrounding Quetzalcoatlus lawsoni came to light in 2021. Some paleontologists argue that, due to the fact we haven't discovered many wing bones from the larger species, that Quetzalcoatlus is too generic to even certify as a genus, and that scientists are showing wishful thinking by classifying Quetzalcoatlus northropi as an actual animal, unique in itself. Arguments exist that as we don't know Quetzalcoatlus wing bones well, the bones we do have could have been from a genus of pterosaur already known to science, who may have migrated cross-continent from Europe or Africa, like modern-day birds do. Similar bones have been unearthed in Europe, and several giant Asdarchid genera are known from both Europe and Asia, as well as North America. So, could all these bones be linked? Some views even take it to the point where animals such as Hatzegopteryx, a giant Asdarchid, known from what was once Hateg Island in what is now Romania, are seen as European migratory species of Quetzalcoatlus, or vice versa. More discoveries need to be made before scientists can say for certain what the case is with this controversial genus of reptile. We do know, however, that these giant reptiles did indeed exist in some way or another. The evidence is there. The bones are real. We just need to agree on the science behind which species is which. Quetzalcoatlus does not sound like a particularly familiar name amongst prehistoric reptiles. Many pterosaurs end their names with the suffix -don or -rincus, and the animal isn't particularly Quetzal-like at all. So how did scientists land on the peculiar name? It turns out that this giant flying reptile has quite the namesake, a god. In Aztec religion, Quetzalcoatl was one of the key gods. He was related to the wind, the sun, merchants, arts and crafts, and education. He was the tutelary of the Aztec pantheon, in fact, the guardian or patron of the entire religion, revered by millions of people across Mesoamerica before Christopher Columbus and the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 15th century to mark the beginning of the end of the Aztec Empire. This is where our gigantic pterosaur takes its name. Quetzalcoatl took many forms, some of which include crows, macaws, monkeys, ducks, and elements such as the wind, as well as the Quetzal itself. The most famous of all his forms, however, is a mighty feathered serpent, a huge snake with bright green and yellow scales, huge wings, and a brilliant mane of feathers. This form of Quetzalcoatl, specifically the sheer size and general connotations associated with being a god, combined with the discovery of Quetzalcoatlus in close proximity to Mexico, is indeed how this giant got his name. The species names, on the other hand, Northropi and Lawsoni, honor people. Douglas A. Lawson, discoverer of the genus, and John Knudsen Northrop, the founder of Northrop Corporation, who assisted with leading the way in large, tailless aircraft designs, which coincidentally resemble the giant pterosaur. Due to the fact that limited Quetzalcoatlus northropi fossils have been unearthed, combined with the complete lack of extant animals which in any way resemble the giant pterosaur, it is difficult for paleontologists to discern exactly how such a creature lived. Behavior is very hard to determine from fossils alone, as rarely is there any evidence for it. So scientists have had to infer possible behaviors from the bones alone, based on their size, shape, and form. Behavior can also be implied by comparing the bones with living animals filling similar ecological niches. In this case, long-beaked aerial carnivores such as storks. Quetzalcoatlus fossils were discovered a long distance from the coastline, roughly 250 miles away from the nearest sea, in fact. Moreover, the Javelina Formation is not associated with rivers or lakes. There were no large bodies of water around the area where the known Quetzalcoatlus specimens died. This was enough evidence for Lawson to determine that the giant pterosaur was not a piscivore. It was not hunting fish like Pteranodon, or skimming across the waves like Nyctosaurus, two contemporary pterosaurs from other parts of Cretaceous North America. Rather, Lawson initially suggested that Quetzalcoatlus was a scavenger, much like a modern-day vulture, swooping down from the air on the carcasses of large animals killed by apex predators such as theropod dinosaurs. As such, Lawson suggested that a main food source for the Azhdarchid was the colossal corpses of dead Alamosauruses, a huge titanosaur native to the Javelina Formation from the same time period as Quetzalcoatlus. This is still in debate though. Other propositions were put forward in 1996 by Thomas Lehman and Juan Langston Jr. from Texas Tech University, which suggested that Quetzalcoatlus was not a scavenger, but was indeed actually a wave skimmer. They pointed out that the pterosaur's lower mandible was bent downwards to the point where there was a 5-centimeter gap between both jaws when the mouth was fully closed. This is comparable to modern-day skimmers, American seabirds which are known to snap up fish on the wing when hawking over the surf, snapping shut their long lower jaw when they feel a fish at the surface. This in turn was contested again in 2007, when subsequent studies showed that the pterosaur was too large for this to be an energy-efficient way of feeding. The most up-to-date theory on Quetzalcoatlus's feeding habits comes from contemporary paleontologists Mark Witten and Darren Naish, who acknowledge again that the remains of the giant pterosaur were located far from the sea. An ocean-going pterosaur would have no business appearing this far inland, unless it was feeding on a variety of different food sources like modern gulls do, for example. They also noted that the jaws of Quetzalcoatlus are in no way proportionate to modern skimmers, and that the pterosaur's beak, head, and neck would be ill-equipped to deal with the pressures of skim feeding. They then presented the most credible explanation for Quetzalcoatlus's feeding behaviors, that this giant pterosaur was an active hunter. Theoretically, no small to medium-sized vertebrate was safe when it came to a hunting Quetzalcoatlus. Able to scour the land from above on the wing to locate their meals, they could then fly down and pursue their prey. This included everything from baby sauropods to small reptiles and amphibians. When on the ground, they would be capable of swiftly catching up to their target due to their unique body plan suited to running across the ground. Then, when they caught up with their quarry, they would loom their long giraffe-like necks over the unfortunate tetrapod below, snapping it up in their colossal jaws. With a combination of unfamiliar looks and a looming, intimidating stance, Quetzalcoatlus would have been one of the most awe-inspiring sights of the entire Mesozoic era, as it picked off small dinosaurs from the open plains of the Javelina Formation in the final days of the Cretaceous. Now, if you were to take a look up towards the sky on any given day in the 21st century, you would certainly not see anything quite as large as Quetzalcoatlus northropi, soaring amongst the clouds. The largest flying animal alive today is the wandering albatross, a huge seabird native to the oceans and islands across the southern hemisphere. It boasts an impressive wingspan of 3.5 meters from tip to tip, massive by modern bird standards. Now, as big as the wandering albatross might be, its wingspan is just over a quarter of that of Quetzalcoatlus northropi. So how could an animal this large get itself off the ground? Or more appropriately, could it actually even take off at all? Experiments to put this question to the test were not initiated until 1984, with the advent of technology allowing for advanced biomechanical studies. Aeronautical engineer Paul MacCready was the first to do so. He built a model aircraft known as an ornithopter, the same size as the largest Quetzalcoatlus, hooked it up with a basic computer to act as an autopiloting device, and put it to the test. The experiment was a success. The ornithopter flew with ease, as it moved in the same manner as the giant pterosaur would have theoretically done in life, a combination of wing flapping and soaring on air currents with its massive wings. The only thing that might alter the accuracy of this experiment is the weight of MacCready's ornithopter. His device weighed about 80 kilograms, which was the assumed weight of the pterosaur at the time of construction. Modern studies have shown that Quetzalcoatlus northropi was likely much heavier. Roughly 200 kilograms have been put forward. We cannot be entirely sure of exactly how heavy this animal would have been, with only fossilized remains to go off. It is difficult to get a truly accurate measurement on estimation alone. In 2010, further studies were undertaken, first by Donald Henderson, who argued that Quetzalcoatlus was in fact 540 kilograms in weight and must have been far too heavy to lift itself off the ground to fly. Rather, this pterosaur would have lived a ground-based lifestyle, using its powerful limbs to chase after prey and its superior height to spot it. Mike Habib and Mark Witten followed this up later on in the same year. They used their own calculations on the animal's weight, mixed with the size of its wings and aerodynamics, combined with advanced and much more modern computer modeling, to conclude that Quetzalcoatlus could in fact fly. Their studies showed that the giant pterosaur could likely fly for around 10 days straight at a time, at speeds up to 130 kilometers an hour, at heights of around 4,500 meters in the sky. Witten and Habib argued that Henderson was using outdated estimates and models on his research, and in turn conducted their own studies to estimate whether or not this giant of the skies was actually that. Furthermore, they concluded that Quetzalcoatlus would have put in a lot of effort to take off, rapidly flapping its wings to gain altitude, to then soar on air currents like modern birds of prey. While subsequent studies, such as Kevin Padian's in 2021, support this view that Quetzalcoatlus was a powerful flyer, the current scientific stance as of 2022 is that large Azhdarchids such as Quetzalcoatlus would only have flown when they really needed to. For a large animal to fly as masterfully as it would have in Witten and Habib's initial 2010 proposal, a large amount of energy needed to be expended. Moreover, they were not even able to soar. They were too heavy. Instead, they would have traveled in short bursts of flight every now and then. Perhaps they would employ this technique when trying to escape a large predatory theropod dinosaur, or to quickly close distance on fast-moving, fleeing prey. Many genera and species of Azhdarchid, that is, pterosaurs in the family Azhdarchidae, where we find our Quetzalcoatlus, were not like many other pterosaurs. The name Azhdarchid itself originated from folklore and is draped in legend, roughly translating to mythological serpent from the Persian language. The telltale signs of Azhdarchid pterosaurs were both obvious and spectacular. Long, crane-like necks, which supported incredibly long, almost disproportionate jaws on the end of a relatively small head. Crests were usually either absent or small, but some species did have noticeable cranial protrusions that would have been used for display purposes in life. Many Azhdarchids were very large in size, and their wings were some of the most spectacular biological tools ever to evolve, many of which would have dwarfed the wings of modern-day bird species. Many Azhdarchids were just as well suited to a life on the ground as they were to a life on the wing, maybe even more so for the former. Their legs were long, and their arms were used as massive stilts, helping them push themselves after their prey, which usually consisted of small dinosaurs and other tetrapod vertebrates, such as lizards or amphibians. In comparison to the fauna of the 21st century, many Azhdarchid pterosaurs are some of the most unfamiliar vertebrate organisms ever to live. Nothing alive today even remotely resembles them. The Azhdarchids, as a wider family, were not just restricted to North America. By the time the late Cretaceous period rolled around, Azhdarchids had found themselves in many paleontological significant locations the world over, from the furthest reaches of South America to the other side of the world in northern Asia. Some of the pterosaurs represented in the family Azhdarchidae are more well known than you might expect. We mentioned it earlier, but you may already be familiar with Hatzegopteryx, a huge pterosaur similar in size to the massive Quetzalcoatlus northropi that lived on what was once Hateg Island in Eastern Europe. It is a genera that is becoming more and more well known to the general public, thanks to exposure in paleomedia and art. Most notably in the 2011 BBC documentary Planet Dinosaur, where Hatzegopteryx featured in the 6th and final episode. These giant pterosaurs were shown descending from the sky in small flocks, hopping after small island-dwelling sauropods who had greatly reduced in size as a result of insular dwarfism. This was a genera very similar to our Quetzalcoatlus, and the two species were very similar in their colossal sizes. Many more Azhdarchids were considerably less familiar. Some of the Asian representatives of the family are other contenders for the largest flying creature ever to live, and should more evidence be found, they may one day overthrow our current champion. Aramborgiania, for example, a giant Azhdarchid unearthed from sediments in Jordan in 1989, had a neck that on its own measured 3 meters in length. For comparison, the average neck of a modern giraffe is around 2 meters in length. Volga Draco, an Azhdarchid unearthed near the Volga River in Russia in 2008, is another potential candidate. Despite the fact that the Azhdarchidae family contained some of the most spectacularly huge creatures ever to fly, there were a few more conservative members when it came to size. Little Radiodactylus, from sediments close to Fort Worth in Texas, had a wingspan of around 1.5 meters, but retained the unfamiliar proportions of its gigantic cousins, with a huge beak relative to its body size. An example of an Azhdarchid of intermediate size was the slightly larger Navajo Draco, found in New Mexico, a relative stone's throw from Radiodactylus. This pterosaur had a wingspan of 3.5 meters in total, huge by modern standards, but a drop in the ocean when it comes to some of the titans of the sky boasted by the wider Azhdarchidae family. All in all, Quetzalcoatlus' relatives were a diverse bunch. Earlier on in this video, we mentioned that Quetzalcoatlus bones were discovered in the Javelina Formation in sediments within Big Bend National Park. But what was the area like when our giant pterosaur was coursing the skies and plains of the late Cretaceous? Quetzalcoatlus would have lived in a wide open landscape of arid plains, with sparse woodland dotted across patches of the area. From ground level, the sky would have been dramatic, visible from nearly all angles. To see a colossal Azhdarchid glide across the plains, coming in to land in pursuit of a herd of small dinosaurs, would have truly been an amazing sight. In terms of the vertebrate fauna of the Javelina Formation, the wide open plains gave rise to huge herds of the biggest dinosaur ever discovered in North America, the 30-meter-long saltosaurid titanosaur, Alamosaurus, the northern relative of the colossal Argentinosaurus, another iconic giant of the Mesozoic we have previously covered on this channel. Alamosaurus fossils are common in the Javelina Formation, and vast herds of the huge sauropod would have lived in close proximity and familiarity with the Quetzalcoatlus species. With plenty of space to grow and evolve, many dinosaur genera out on the Javelina plains were able to grow massive off of the plentiful food sources. Ceratopsians such as Torosaurus would have gathered, potentially in large herds, which were in turn preyed upon by the most famous dinosaur of all time, Tyrannosaurus rex. Among them were saurolophine hadrosaurs, such as Critosaurus, one of a couple hadrosaur genera, some of which are as yet unnamed. The Javelina Formation wasn't just composed of giants, however. Small theropods, such as Saurornitholestes and Troodon, stalked the land in pursuit of smaller vertebrates, lizards, fish, and perhaps the occasional early mammal. Rays swam in the sparse water covering of the region, and other pterosaurs would have whirled and looped in the skies above. The name Quetzalcoatlus has been ever present across the time the huge aerial reptile has been known to science, and not just to the scientists who named and discovered it. Quetzalcoatlus's huge size and bizarre form has seen it appear frequently in paleomedia across the board over the years, from books to television shows, toys, and even movies. It is not uncommon to read about the Azhdarchid in books on dinosaurs and prehistoric life, citing it as the flying reptile as big as a plane. It's almost too amazing to be true. The thought of a giant dragon-like reptile gliding through the end Cretaceous skies has drawn the interest of a huge number of people, and with very good reason at that. Quetzalcoatlus was actually featured in a popular film very recently, and surprisingly it wasn't too bad of a depiction, Jurassic World Dominion, the most recent release in the Jurassic World sequel franchise, featured a short clip of Quetzalcoatlus landing and flocking across a lake in the evening sunlight. The pterosaurs are shown pretty much anatomically accurate, with a full coating of feathers and the classic long neck and jaws. The only thing we can pick out here is the general size. The pterosaurs in the movie were much larger than the real thing, although the real thing in itself was undoubtedly just as spectacular as the animals depicted in Jurassic World Dominion. Subsequently, Quetzalcoatlus played a larger part in the accompanying video game developed by Frontier Developments, Jurassic World Evolution 2, where players could add a hyper-realistic Quetzalcoatlus Northropi to their prehistoric theme parks. To this day, Quetzalcoatlus remains perhaps the most famous pterosaur, after the ubiquitously known Pteranodon, and with very good reason. Such an awe-inspiring animal demands attention.
They lived in the late Cretaceous period, about 85.8 to 70.6 million years ago. But it wasn't until 1993 that the Velociraptor became world famous when it had its starring turn in the film Jurassic Park. Although, as we'll go into later, this film depiction isn't exactly accurate. The Velociraptor is just as interesting in real life as it was depicted on film. Today, we're going to deep dive into this historic hunter, from the first discoveries to famous Velociraptor fossils. The first known Velociraptor fossil was discovered on the 11th of August, 1923, in the Gobi Desert on an American Museum of Natural History expedition. The Gobi Desert is located in southern Mongolia and areas of northern China. At the time, this was one of the most remote places on Earth, accessible only by reliable vehicles and trustworthy horses. But it was rich with potential dinosaur fossil finds. Roy Chapman Andrews led the expedition into an area of the desert called Chadakta. Andrews was known for his adventurous exploits, and some people think he was the inspiration for Indiana Jones. He led expeditions to Mongolia's Gobi Desert from 1921 to 1930. His team found many significant discoveries, including the first nest of dinosaur eggs to ever be found in 1923. And as you might have guessed, on these expeditions, the Velociraptor was discovered. Amongst the dirt and dust, a member of Andrews' team, Peter Kaizen, found an impressive claw, alongside a complete, albeit crushed, skull, about 176 millimeters in length. Although we know now that this ferocious-looking claw comes from a Velociraptor foot, at the time, Henry Fairfield Osborn, the president of the American Museum of Natural History, published drawings in 1924, assuming this was a claw, and named the specimen Velociraptor mongoliensis, which roughly translates to speedy thief from Mongolia, or quick plunderer. The world was introduced to the Velociraptor. Well, almost. Originally, Osborn had called the dinosaur discovery Oviraptor judicatari when he wrote about the discovery in the news. However, he never used this name in a scientific journal, and Velociraptor quickly became the official name for this creature. Henry Fairfield Osborn recognized that this dinosaur would have been a speedy predator, hence the name he chose for it. which is a combination of two Latin words, velox, meaning swift or quick, and raptor, which means thief or plunderer. Politics prevented further American expeditions into Mongolia a few years later, when a communist revolution overthrew the Mongolian government. With the help of allies from the Soviet Union and Poland, Mongolian researchers returned to the fossil site where Kaizen discovered the raptor claw over and over again. They eventually found one of the most famous velociraptor fossils ever discovered, and one we'll cover later in this video. In 1971, a velociraptor caught struggling with a protoceratops, fossilized in combat for eternity. There are two known species of velociraptor. Velociraptor mongoliensis, the specimen discovered in the Gobi Desert in 1923, and the Velociraptor osmolskae, identified in 2008. The two species are very similar. The Velociraptor osmolskae was discovered in another part of the Gobi Desert called the Bayan Mondahu Formation. A Polish paleontologist called Halszka Osmolska is the namesake inspiration for this new specimen, but it was classified and identified by another paleontologist called Pascal Godefroy. Although not as famous as the American Museum of Natural History expeditions in the 1920s, the Polish-Mongolian expeditions undertaken by Halszka Osmolska and her team in 1965 to 1970 found many significant discoveries that aided modern understanding of dinosaurs. Osmolska herself was involved with first describing dinosaurs like the Dinocheirus, Bagaceratops, and Barsboldia. So what are the differences between the two species? Well, there are a lot of similarities between the two. For example, both species have a large teardrop-shaped hole in their skull. But Godefroy's team found enough differences between the Velociraptor mongoliensis and Velociraptor osmolskae to classify the latter as a new species. For example, there are differences in the serration and structure of the teeth. Finding a new species brings up questions for paleontologists and researchers, which are still questioned today. Why did two different species develop? One line of speculation is the slight differences in plant life between the Bayan Mondahu and Jadokta formations. Some theorize that the two species lived at the same time, but were separated by some form of geographical barrier. But this isn't a theory widely subscribed to. The Velociraptor was a small theropod, the type of dinosaur who walks on two hind legs and has three-toed limbs. It was about 1.8 meters long, about 5'9", and stood about half a meter high, about 1 foot 6 inches, similar sizes to a large turkey or a coyote, and about 1/3 the height of the average adult. They were a lightweight creature, weighing between 7 and 15 kilograms. But mighty things can come in small packages. The Velociraptor had clawed hands and feet. The 3 claws on its hands were large and flexible. They walked on 2 toes, keeping their second toe, a long claw, up in the air, ensuring it was sharp enough to restrain prey effectively. Researchers discovered this by looking at preserved tracks from velociraptors and its relatives. There are no marks made by the middle claw. This long claw could grow up to 6.5 centimeters, making it a great weapon. This wasn't for disemboweling other dinosaurs. and there isn't any evidence of the famous toe tapping in the tense Jurassic Park scenes in the kitchen. Sorry to disappoint. The claw was only sharp at the point, so slashing prey would have been tricky to do. Dr. David Button clarified that this claw would have been used for stabbing and preventing prey from escaping. He told the Natural History Museum that if you look at the claw, it looks just like the talon of an eagle, which is used to grip prey and pin it down. Velociraptor probably used its sickle-shaped talon to injure, subdue, and grip its prey before dispatching it with its jaws. Dr. Button clarifies that even though Velociraptor wouldn't have been running around disemboweling prey, it wouldn't have been particularly nice to meet. The Velociraptor had many sharp, pointed teeth in its upper and lower jaws, but not a beak like some dinosaurs. The teeth had an intimidating serration, with sharp edges on each individual tooth, and increasing in intensity from the front of its mouth to the back. To keep their teeth sharp, they were replaced throughout a Velociraptor's life, similar to a Tyrannosaurus rex. The teeth of the Velociraptor also curved backwards, which was convenient for gripping prey and preventing it from escaping. Its narrow jaws and small build tell us that the Velociraptor usually went for smaller prey, but its teeth leave no doubt that this was a carnivore. The Velociraptor's box-like skull was quite large for its size, about 23 centimeters or 9.1 inches. It had a long, narrow snout, which made up about 60% of its entire skull. A slender snout is useful for catching speedy prey, as the Velociraptor could make quick, snappy bites. The Velociraptor is famous for its intelligence, even learning how to open doors, according to Jurassic Park, but was likely to be on par with the average cat or dog, which is to say, it was fairly intelligent, but perhaps not smarter than dolphins, smarter than primates, as a fictional paleontologist claims in Jurassic Park 3, released in 2001. This estimation is based on something called the encephalization quotient. That is, the comparison of brain size to body, which can help determine how intelligent an animal is. According to the Natural History Museum, the Velociraptor's brain size, in comparison to its body, was high compared to other animals, including other dinosaurs at the time. There are some suggestions this dinosaur was nocturnal, thanks to a large sclerotic ring, which is a ring of bone found inside the eye socket, which supports the eye. Creatures that live or hunt at night have larger holes in the middle of the sclerotic ring, which means as much light as possible can be let into the eye. Researchers Lars Schmitz and Ryosuke Motani used a sample of skulls to work out when dinosaurs were active. According to their results, predatory dinosaurs like the Velociraptor and Microraptor were mostly nocturnal. Some exceptions in their study were determined to be cathemeral, which means they were active in short bursts during the day. This theory is supported by modern animal behavior. Most carnivores are nocturnal. Whilst there are still studies ongoing on this topic, it is certainly food for thought. Think about how often you've seen illustrations of dinosaurs hunting and living in broad daylight. In reality, the dinosaur world may have functioned 24 hours a day. The Velociraptor was covered in fine, feather-like coverings. paleontologists have a fair amount of evidence to make them confident in this fact. And the velociraptor isn't the only feathered carnivorous dinosaur to roam Central Asia in the late Cretaceous period. There were also dinosaurs like Zanabazar, Con, and the Conchoraptor. For example, close relatives like the Microraptor have been discovered with preserved feathers. In 2007, a velociraptor forearm was discovered with the imprints of quills, showing that 14 long feathers would have protruded from its second finger up to its arm. The feathers would have provided warmth for the velociraptor, which would have been important, according to Dr. David Button, who explains that there's quite good evidence for dromaeosaurs having elevated metabolisms. If you're generating a lot of warmth, if you lose it, you're wasting loads of energy. Feathers would stop velociraptors losing energy and keep them warm. Dr. David Button also suggests that velociraptors might have used their wings to protect nests, as specimens of Oviraptorosaurs, who are closely related to the velociraptor, have been found fossilized in position, protecting their eggs like a chicken. Wings could also help manage the temperature of the nests. Feathers are also useful for creating an effective quick plunderer, helping generate speed on inclines by producing a negative lift. The feathers may have also been for display, ready to attract mates, again, similar to modern birds. These weren't feathers for flight. Although velociraptors have fused wishbones and collarbones like modern birds, they're not the correct shape to support flapping wings for flight. Their feathers would have probably been symmetrical, unlike modern birds who have asymmetrical wings. Finally, the wings simply weren't big enough to glide and support the velociraptor's body weight. One journal, Science, has published a study that suggests the velociraptor may have ancestors who could fly, but it lost the ability as it evolved. As we mentioned, the velociraptor was likely warm-blooded. It would have needed a fair amount of energy to hunt. By studying the bones and comparing the velociraptor to modern-day animals, scientists can also determine that the growth rate of a velociraptor was similar to a kiwi bird, a creature with a warm-blooded metabolism. The velociraptor had a long tail, which would have helped it steer when running at high speeds. With hard, fused bones, the tail kept the velociraptor steady as it ran and hunted. It has been traditionally thought that the tail was inflexible, but a recent specimen was found with intact vertebrae curved into an S shape, suggested a degree of flexibility. With muscular legs and this impressive tail, estimates put the velociraptor as running at 40 kilometers per hour, or 24.85 miles per hour in short bursts. Not only is this faster than humans, but it would have been faster than its prey, which is pretty terrifying. Unfortunately for the velociraptor, it's not the quickest dinosaur though. Ornithomimosaurs, who probably ran like ostriches, are estimated to have reached speeds of 70 kilometers per hour, or 43 miles per hour. The velociraptor lived in Central and Eastern Asia, in areas rich in diverse fossil finds, like the Burun Goyat Formation and Jadokta Formation in Mongolia. The velociraptor had neighbors, including the Protoceratops, Oviraptor, Machairosaurus, and Mahakala. The Burun Goyat and Jadokta formations were dry environments filled with sand dunes. although the Barun Goyat environment was slightly damper compared to the Jadokta Formation. If you were lucky, you could find small streams running through the desert, which were great areas for sneaking up on unknowing prey. Given its size, the velociraptor fed on small mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and insects, anything that was easy to overpower and kill. They also occasionally fed on small infant dinosaurs, like young protoceratops, baby oviraptors, and little prenocephaly. Velociraptors took advantage of opportunities to eat. They both hunted and scavenged food. Film depictions of the velociraptor often portray them as pack hunters, which isn't accurate. Velociraptor fossils don't tend to be found in groups, which suggests they lived more isolated lives. The idea of velociraptors as pack hunters has likely come from the discovery of several Deinonychus with a Tenontosaurus. Some researchers take this as evidence of pack hunting, especially considering the size difference between the two creatures, with the Tenontosaurus coming in at about 7 meters in length. But there's still an argument that this isn't irrefutable evidence of pack life. The situation could have been the result of grouping up for opportunistic hunting opportunities, as opposed to creating bonds like a modern wolf pack. Generally, we still don't know much about how the velociraptor behaved socially, or how it cared for its young. Maybe the velociraptor even ate its young, like modern Komodo dragons do. Once a velociraptor identified its prey, they may have used the famous raptor prey restraint technique to devour it. As it sounds, this involved using claws and body weight to restrain prey, which suggests the prey was eaten alive. Today, eagles use the same technique, using their claws to hold down prey whilst they enjoy their meal. Thanks to Jurassic Park, there's probably a distinct sound that comes to mind when you think of velociraptors. Sound designer Al Nelson, who created dinosaur sounds for Jurassic World, released in 2015, admits that we don't know what dinosaurs sounded like. But if you want to hear the creepy grumbles of Tyrannosaurus Rex, check out our video on the topic. However, he claims that scientific accuracy wasn't the point anyway, telling Vanity Fair, "To be honest, much of what we're trying to do is create something that is believable, but also has emotional context and personality. In our case, authenticity comes down to whether you believe that the creature you see sounds like it does." Sounds from the modern animal kingdom were mixed up to create the dinosaur vocalizations in the films, something Nelson described as creating a whole new language and a new creature. The chatter of the velociraptors in Jurassic Park and its sequels is a mixture of African cranes, hissing geese, dogs, dolphin, horses, and infamously, mating tortoises. Higher pitch sounds and lower pitch sounds are combined to give some weight to the sound. In the Jurassic World franchise, these sounds were added to even more, throwing in macaque monkeys, baby orangutans, penguins, happy tigers, and Nelson's pet Labrador into the mix. When it comes to actual velociraptors, they were probably less chatty. Not being pack hunters, they wouldn't have had any need for many of the vocalizations produced by their fictional counterparts. Whilst we don't have solid evidence of what a velociraptor sounded like, and without a time machine, we'll never really know, some researchers believe the Steller's sea eagle may give us a hint, as Steller's sea eagles have similar skull shapes to Velociraptor. Have a listen to its distinct vocalization and see what you think. Other researchers have pointed to the vocalizations of the cassowary as a suggested similar sound. Have a listen and let us know which researchers you think have the best guess. Perhaps it isn't about vocal communication either. We know the Velociraptor had long feathers. This could have also been a communication tool in the same way they are for modern birds. As we mentioned earlier, they could have been useful for attracting a mate. Based on current fossil finds, Velociraptors exited the fossil record about 70 million years ago. They went extinct millions of years before a 6-mile-wide asteroid struck the Yucatan Peninsula, creating a ripple effect of events that destroyed and reinvented the ecosystem at the time. However, other raptors in their family tree, known as Dromaeosauridae, continue to exist until their mass extinction event. The Velociraptor is part of a group called Eudromaeosauria, a subgroup of Dromaeosauridae. Members of this family tree tend to share large hands with 3 strong claws and were rather intelligent. Dromaeosauridae are bird-like dinosaurs that range from medium to small sizes and tend to have similar characteristics, like serrated teeth and large claws. The Velociraptor was smaller compared to some of its ancestors. For comparison, the Dromaeosauridae group also includes the Utahraptor. The fluffy Utahraptor, living in the early Cretaceous period, about 112 to 100 million years ago, clocked in at a colossal 6 meters long and weighed about 1,000 kilograms. It's probably unsurprising that this is the world's largest raptor to ever be discovered so far. In 1975, a paleontologist from Brigham Young University called Jim Jensen gathered a collection of theropod bones from a dig site called Dalton Wells in Utah. However, these bones sat unidentified until 1991, when paleontologist Jim Kirkland and his team were digging in the fossil fertile lands outside Moab, Utah. Kirkland found the jaw of a theropod first, but it was the discovery of a long, curved claw that gave the game away. This was a raptor. This claw fossil was eventually classified as the Utahraptor austramazi, but not before some other name suggestions, including Dinoraptor and Spielbergi, the latter in honor of the director of Jurassic Park, Steven Spielberg, or perhaps to try to gain some funding from the world-famous director. Kirkland then recognized the bones discovered by Jim Jensen as belonging to a Utahraptor, which allowed researchers to gather enough evidence to get a better idea of how the dinosaur looked. As well as its massive size, the Utahraptor might have used its claw in a different way to its ancestors. Angelica Torices, a paleontologist at the University of La Rioja, says the claws on the hand seem to have been more specialized for cutting than other dromaeosaurs. The jaw of the Utahraptor is angled slightly more forward compared to other raptors, but it is likely it used the same form of eating as other meat-eating dinosaurs, the grip and rip. Our understanding of the Utahraptor and how it compares to its ancestors like the Velociraptor increased further in 2001, when dozens of Utahraptor bones were discovered in Moab. From young raptors to juveniles to one adult, this find was fascinating and helped researchers discover things like the bulkiness of adult Utahraptors, unlike their slender family members. the last known surviving raptor species, lived in the area now known as New Mexico 67 million years ago. The Dinaobellator nodohesperus was discovered in 2008 by Robert Sullivan. This species was named as a tribute to those who lived in the region of the San Juan Basin in New Mexico. It translates to Navajo warrior from the southwest. This dinosaur was a similar size to the Velociraptor. The Dinaobellator stood 1 meter tall, about 3.5 feet, and was about 2 meters long, or 6 to 7 feet. Like its ancestors, it was a light, agile predator covered in feathers. Years of evolution had given this dromaeosaurid a more flexible tail compared to other members of its family tree, something Stephen Jeskinski, who worked with Robert Sullivan and Peter Dodson to study and record this discovery, compares to a cat's tail, explaining that, while the tail itself remains straight, it is also whipping around constantly as the animal is changing direction. This would have helped the Dinaobellator when chasing prey. The Velociraptor is not just famous for its film career. There have also been some amazing Velociraptor fossils found. One example is a Velociraptor locked in combat with a Protoceratops, a fossil which is now a national treasure in the country it was found in, Mongolia. The fighting dinosaurs fossil was discovered in 1971 by a Polish-Mongolian team. Although it is unlikely that these two were mortal enemies, the battle certainly looks ferocious. The Velociraptor's long foot claw is embedded in the Protoceratops' throat, whilst the Protoceratops is crushing the Velociraptor's arm in its mouth, which probably broke the Velociraptor's arm. Thanks to Lars Schmitz and Ryosuke Motani's study on the sclerotic rings of dinosaurs, we can guess this battle probably took place at dawn or dusk, which is most likely the time of day these creatures would have crossed paths. Whilst you might hope the plucky Velociraptor won this fight, it is probably unlikely. Generally, fights like these go to the bulkiest creature, which would be the Protoceratops in this case. So why did this Velociraptor take on a Protoceratops? This question is still debated. Was it a case of desperation and starvation? Or was the Velociraptor an inexperienced hunter? To quote Dr. David Hone, was it young and dumb? Was the Protoceratops particularly vulnerable for some reason? Generally, it is rare for predators to take on prey over double their size. As Dr. David Button points out, carnivores tend to only attack something larger if it's sick, injured, or old. They don't want to risk injury themselves, as it could be fatal. A broken leg, for example, would stop it from being able to hunt. The fighting dinosaurs were forever preserved after being buried, perhaps due to a collapsed sand dune or a sandstorm. Despite the rareness of this encounter, this doesn't mean the Velociraptor wasn't partial to the occasional Protoceratops snack when it could get one. In 2008, fossil hunters unearthed Protoceratops fossils with bite marks from raptor teeth, alongside 2 teeth belonging to Dromaeosauridae, like a Velociraptor. After analyzing the specimen, researchers were able to determine that the herbivore hadn't been killed by a raptor. There was little meat left on it, hence the bite marks, suggesting that this corpse was scavenged. Velociraptors were more partial to hunting than scavenging. For example, they didn't have the size to scare off other dinosaurs from a kill, or the jaw strength to bite through bone. But it did happen. Additionally, the Velociraptor was made for hunting. Its physical attributes made it an effective predator, which meant it did not have as much need to scavenge regularly. Another famous velociraptor fossil also tells us a little bit about their diet and lifestyle. This fossil was first discovered in the Gobi Desert in 1994, but it wasn't until 2012 when Dr. David Hone and his team of international researchers published a paper describing a velociraptor fossil preserved with a large pterosaur bone in its guts, wedged in the upper part of the velociraptor's rib cage, where the stomach would have been located. This situation was most likely to also be the result of scavenging, given the size difference between the two dinosaurs. The pterosaur had a wingspan of 2 meters, or around 6.5 feet, so would have made a difficult and dangerous target. So it seems even the velociraptor wouldn't turn down a freebie. The pterosaur bone is 75 millimeters long and in remarkably good condition, so the velociraptor may have died soon after eating the bone. As Dr. David Hone pointed out, that the bone has no unusual traces of marks or deformation that could be attributed to digestive acids. The velociraptor had an injury to its ribs when it died, which may have contributed to its demise. The velociraptor became famous when it starred alongside the Tyrannosaurus Rex in Steven Spielberg's 1993 adaptation of the novel Jurassic Park. But the velociraptors in the film Jurassic Park are not really velociraptors at all. The fictional villains of Spielberg's film are closer in resemblance to Deinonychus, another relation to the velociraptor. The Deinonychus was bigger than the velociraptor and had slightly different facial features. Additionally, the two dinosaurs lived 30 million years apart from each other. The mix-up stems from what the National Geographic called a game of pop science telephone. Michael Crichton, who is the author of Jurassic Park and its sequel The Lost World, consulted a text by American paleontologist Gregory Paul called Predatory Dinosaurs of the World. It is worth noting that Gregory Paul went on to be credited as one of the dinosaur experts for Jurassic Park. In Predatory Dinosaurs of the World, Paul said that Deinonychus and the velociraptor could be grouped together as the same thing. This idea made it into Crichton's novel, which then made it into the film. Jack Horner, the famous paleontologist who wants to make a chickenosaur dinosaur creature, and who was the supposed inspiration for Jurassic Park's protagonist Alan Grant, upheld this idea in subsequent interviews about the film, despite the notion being later rejected by most paleontologists. Thus, in the media's eyes, the velociraptor and the Deinonychus have been consistently mixed up and mislabeled. This sort of mix-up does happen in paleontology. On occasion, different scientists will bestow the same specimen with different names, or a new specimen gets given a name already in use for another creature, and thus a new name needs to be assigned. From this mix-up, there are several misconceptions about velociraptors that still prevail among some people today. We've covered some of these already in this video, but here's a recap of some of the key differences between film velociraptors and real velociraptors. As we've learned, the velociraptor was just under 2 meters long and less than 1 meter in height. In comparison, the Deinonychus was 3 meters long and could reach just over 1 meter in height. Because of Jurassic Park, people are often surprised at the velociraptor's smaller stature. The lack of feathers was another huge difference between actual velociraptors and their scaly, reptilian, filmic counterparts featured on Jurassic Park and its subsequent sequels and spin-offs. When dinosaurs were first discovered, researchers thought they were large, scaly, lizard-like creatures. The term dinosaur, coined by paleontologist Richard Owen in 1842, created the word by combining two Greek words, dinos, which translates to terrible and fearfully great, and saur, which means lizard. As research has developed and more discoveries have been made, many paleontologists agree that many dinosaurs, and maybe even most dinosaurs, had a feathery coating. This development in research hasn't translated into our mainstream media. Professor John O. Maliarca, a professor of film and television at Kingston University, thinks that Hollywood wouldn't have allowed feathery dinosaurs to come onto screen. He says, "I don't think they would have allowed feathered animals to be the monstrous creatures. There's something about feathers that's just a bit comical." Jack Horner also defended the featherless velociraptors in Jurassic World, pointing out that, "We made the best dinosaurs we could at the time. We can't say that we're going to have feathered dinosaurs brought back now. We need to keep the consistency." Jurassic Park 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all pieces of one story, and so, unfortunately, we can't change the way the dinosaurs look. On the other hand, some paleontologists object to the fact that recent scientific discoveries aren't being represented on the big screen, especially in the Jurassic World franchise, which began 2015, a time well after the feathered dinosaur theory was established in the scientific community. Dr. David Button thinks it's a shame they don't put feathers on the velociraptor in the Jurassic Park movies. They'd actually be much creepier because it would be something we recognize, but a bit wrong. Who do you agree with? The idea of velociraptors hunting in packs is evident from the first Jurassic Park film, gaining even more traction in the reboot of the franchise, Jurassic World, which gives each velociraptor a name based on the position in the pack. We haven't gotten any evidence of this behavior in velociraptors at the moment, and nor do we think they would have communicated like they would in the film. And, as discussed earlier, whilst Deinonychus may have hunted in packs, not all paleontologists are convinced this was the case. A key scene which occurs earlier in Jurassic Park involves a dig discovery of a velociraptor by Alan Grant and Ellie Sattler. Obviously, this can't have been a velociraptor, but could have been a Deinonychus. The first specimen of a Deinonychus was actually discovered by Barnum Brown in Montana in 1931. He wasn't very interested in the specimen and named it Daptosaurus. It wasn't until the 1960s that paleontologist John Ostrom officially described and named the Deinonychus. We've established that velociraptors were fairly smart, but not as smart as they were depicted in film. This is likely to be the case for Deinonychus too. They were relatively intelligent for their species, but they certainly wouldn't be hatching up schemes to chase young children around an amusement park. As discussed, the velociraptor is believed to have been pretty speedy. There's still debate on the speed of Deinonychus. Some maintain that this was also a fast creature, but a recent study on the Deinonychus suggests it wasn't as quick or agile as some of its theropod counterparts. In fact, this study pits the dinosaur at a pace of 6 miles per hour, or just under 10 kilometers per hour, which is slower than the average running speed for men, which is 8 miles per hour or about 13 kilometers per hour. This would make a key action scene in Jurassic World, which involves a pack of velociraptors/Deinonychus matching pace with vehicles whilst hunting the fictional dinosaur antagonist of the film, the Indominus Rex, slightly more relaxed in pace. Like many things Spielberg does in the film industry, these ideas about velociraptors have had a lasting impact on how they have been depicted by media and viewed by the public. The velociraptor has gone on to have a varied film career, including hits such as the Lego Batman movie, released in 2017, to lesser-known ventures like the Velocipastor, also released in 2017. So, does the reality of a velociraptor make it a less interesting dinosaur? Absolutely not. There's a reason this creature has captured people's imagination for years. The velociraptor is a fascinating creature, and we've been lucky enough to discover enough specimens to get a glimpse into the everyday lives of this dinosaur. Beams of white light from the late Cretaceous sun filter down into the endless blue ocean, flickering and fading in obscure beams before the light can penetrate no further, collapsing into the deep. The exact location is situated in what will one day become the North African nation of Morocco. But 66 million years ago, the landscape was quite different. This specific spot is a warm, open ocean, far from land. Faint shapes twisting and whirling in the depths could be the shadows of marine megafauna. Or perhaps not. When all is a deep blue, 360 degrees around you, it is hard to tell. One of these shapes trickles up from the depths, massive in proportions. But this is clearly not one animal. Flickering and shimmering in the mid-afternoon light is a school of fish. Specifically, Encotis, a species of ray-finned fish not too distantly related to modern-day lancetfish. The school approaches the surface in large numbers, twisting in convoluted shapes, as its sharp-toothed individuals pick off detritus and small creatures from the lightly lapping waves. These fish need to be wary, however, and team up in shoals for a good reason: predators. Shimmering scales and abnormal shapes have caught the keen eyes of aerial predators hawking over the waves. The nyctosaurid pterosaur, Barbaridactylus. These masters of the oceanic skies whirl over the waves. Their upward-turned beaks, the perfect tools for scooping fish out of the water like a skimmer or gannet. Their bullet-like diving causes the school to scatter in panic, as more and more Encotis are snatched from the waves, a smorgasbord of nutritious food presenting itself freely to those strange aerial reptiles. Some of the fish scatter deeper to avoid the jaws of their attackers from above, but this proves to be equally risky. Below, other shapes have begun to drift above, intrigued by the commotion happening on the surface. Sharks. These species of squally corax, 5 meters in length, and similar in form to many of today's mako or reef sharks. Their sleek, imposing forms can be seen rapidly smashing into the shoal of Encotis, dispersing them, gobbling up mouthful after mouthful of unfortunate fish. This continues for a good while, undisturbed. The pterosaurs and sharks have it made with occurrences like this. Out in the open ocean, it's important to arrive early at sites like these, as Morocco's abundance of marine piscivores means competition is high. Soon the predators outnumber their prey, and the shoal is dwindling. The occasional escapee can be seen safely wandering from the scene unharmed, but the remaining few are trapped in the frenzy. Half-eaten corpses and glittering scales shower down into the depths, as the pterosaur dives become less and less frequent, and the sharks start to retreat to the depths. It would seem, however, that another predator is yet to have its fill of the bounty, and it's not after the small fry. Like something out of Jaws, a huge open mouth protrudes from the murky depths. Rows of teeth betraying the presence of a colossal marine apex predator. The streamlined shape, clearly that of a reptile and not a fish, encloses its jaws around a shark and bursts from the waves like a rocket leaving the planet. The bewildered shark, now suspended a good 2 meters above the water at least, thrashes in fear as the huge reptile releases its grip. The pterosaurs have scattered, and the lucky sharks have now long gone. The shark is tossed into the air and lands several meters away from the launch site, only to appear again a few seconds later when it is bashed into the air by the giant reptile. Upon its grisly return to the disturbed surface of the water, blood pools up in the frothing surface as the giant reptile, Thalassotitan, claims its prize, tearing chunks out of the poor squally corax filling its belly. As it feeds, it becomes strikingly clear what this animal is: a mosasaur. These giants of the seas were the top marine predators in the late Cretaceous, and Thalassotitan rules the roost here. It is colossal, unfathomably so. Held out horizontally, ripping at the dead shark in the waves, its massive tail thrashing from left to right. It is clearly built for this lifestyle of ambushing prey from below, similar to the way some modern-day marine apex predators feed. Leaving a handful of cartilage and gristle behind for the scavengers, the giant mosasaur sinks nonchalantly back into the deep, ambivalent to the destruction in its wake. It might look ecologically barren at first sight, but these seas hold one of the most species-rich marine ecosystems known to science. Towards the end of August 2022, a remarkable new species of marine reptile was described from the Ouled Abdoun Basin near Casablanca, Morocco. Fossils uncovered in the region include beautifully preserved jaws and skulls, which indicate that this creature, named Thalassotitan atrox, was a mosasaur, a new member of a widespread late Cretaceous group of marine apex predator reptiles. The creature's name might give away something about its appearance before even looking at the fossil. Thalassotitan atrox roughly translates from Greek to English as cruel sea giant. Scientists estimate that this mosasaur would have grown to roughly between 9 and 10 meters in length when fully grown, which would have made it one of the largest marine reptiles in the basin at the time, which would have been submerged entirely by ocean, giving rise to awesome new marine creatures, but more on those later. Upon studying the fossil skull and teeth, scientists learned that many of Thalassotitan's teeth were either chipped, broken, or worn down. This isn't just a coincidence, or the result of the passing of time. This is evidence of wear and tear from the huge reptile's feeding habits. Thalassotitan must have used its teeth as a primary weapon to hunt sharks, turtles, and even other mosasaurs, smashing them into the bodies of its unfortunate soon-to-be meals, causing immense damage upon the violent impact. Repeated use of these sharp teeth as weapons would have had a substantial impact on Thalassotitan itself too, however, and many teeth would have been lost or damaged in the process throughout the creature's lifespan. Fortunately, we know that mosasaurs would have been able to replace these teeth, much like a shark is able to. When mammals, for example, break or lose teeth, they aren't able to grow them back. And many teeth have evolved high roots, or the ability to constantly grow existing teeth, to combat this concern. Mosasaurs, however, would have been able to shed old teeth, ensuring that no matter how often they needed to use them to catch prey, there would always be a steady supply on the way if some of them were broken or lost. Thalassotitan roamed the seas of Morocco 66 million years ago in the late Cretaceous period. Specifically, it existed in the Maastrichtian Age, the very final slice of time that made up the Mesozoic era. Elsewhere in the world at the time, other giant mosasaurs would have thrived in the oceans. Tyrannosaurus rex would have hunted herds of Triceratops, and the skies were filled with many strange species of pterosaur. It also would have been around to witness one of the worst disasters in all of planet Earth's history, the Chicxulub asteroid impact, famous for contributing heavily to the end Cretaceous mass extinction 66 million years ago. Prior to that, though, the Moroccan oceans belonged to Thalassotitan. As one of the largest predators uncovered in that area, scientists have deduced that it was likely the apex predator of its time and region. Perhaps as a baby, it would have been vulnerable to attacks from sharks and other mosasaurs. But once it reached adulthood, that was that. There were very few creatures in the Cretaceous seas that could have brought harm to a fully grown Thalassotitan, and it sat proudly at the top of the food web. Think of Thalassotitan as a prehistoric killer whale or great white shark. It filled the same ecological niche as these modern-day apex predators, but on a bigger, less familiar scale. Although the story that opened this video was fictitious, it is truly awe-inspiring to imagine feeding frenzies taking place in the open oceans of Cretaceous Morocco in the same manner of the ones we see with sardines, sharks, gannets, and whales in the modern day. Only, when frenzies finish in today's open oceans, there usually isn't anything to prey on the sharks when they've had their fill. As we've already touched on, mosasaurs were an incredibly diverse group of marine apex predators that ruled the roost within the Cretaceous seas and oceans toward the end of the Mesozoic era. Thalassotitan had a very large family tree, and elsewhere in the world, at the time of its existence, swam many other species of mosasaur, some even larger than itself. Thalassotitan wasn't even the only mosasaur that swam in the Maastrichtian Moroccan seas either. Alongside it were over 10 other species that would have interacted with or been preyed upon by Thalassotitan. These included some very sizable species, including Prognathodon, Thalassotitan's closest relative, and Mosasaurus, star of the 2015 science fiction monster movie Jurassic World. Alongside these mosasaurs were several other less well-known species, including Gavialimimus, Halosaurus, Carinodens, Pleurodens, Xenodens, and Arameosaurus. These species were all carnivorous, feeding on anything from fish to shellfish, turtles to sharks, mosasaurs to pterosaurs. Perhaps even the odd dinosaur or two would have met its end at the hands of a Moroccan mosasaur when trying to pass over stretches of water. But what was a mosasaur? Where did they come from? Extant from around 101 to 66 million years ago, mosasaurs are actually members of an existing order of reptiles that survived to modern day, Squamata. This is a massive order of modern reptiles, made up of snakes and lizards, making them the mosasaurs' closest living relatives. It is likely that the mosasaurs themselves evolved from a group of semi-aquatic lizards, the Aegialosaurs. Take an Aegialosaur and put it in a zoo's reptile house, and it wouldn't look too out of place amongst the monitor lizards in the neighboring tanks. Its exhibit would need much more water, however, and the lizard itself would look slightly different. Shorter limbs and a deep, paddle-like tail would set it aside from these modern-day species. But it was the giant apex predator mosasaurs that would arise from this humble stock, Thalassotitan included. Hinged jaws and flexible skulls, adaptable for tackling prey items of many different varieties, is just one trait that mosasaurs share with modern snakes, and many species were likely to have gobbled up their entire catches whole. What was this food, though? Well, whatever the giant reptiles could catch. For the biggest mosasaurs, such as Thalassotitan, Prognathodon, Mosasaurus, and North America's Tylosaurus, anything and everything was on the menu, as long as it could fit in their mouths and didn't put up enough of a fight. This includes a banquet of readily available foodstuffs from the Cretaceous depths, including fish, both large and small, as well as sharks. Ammonites would have been taken, and fossil shells have been discovered with mosasaur puncture wounds from their crushing teeth. Marine reptiles, including hard-shelled turtles, would have been preyed upon, but these predators would have also taken bigger reptilian game. Both long and short-necked plesiosaurs and other mosasaurs themselves were not safe. Add to that the abundance of large seabirds and the odd dinosaur, and you've got a healthy, balanced diet of one of the most terrifying marine predators ever to live. Thalassotitan's ancient bones were dug up in the Oulad Abdoun Basin, not too far from the major city of Casablanca in Morocco, in what is now northwest Africa. It is a major site for phosphate sedimentary rocks and houses some of the most diverse marine paleofauna of anywhere in prehistory. The fossils in the basin span a length of 25 million years. Not all of the creatures would have directly coexisted in that time frame, but Thalassotitan would have been an imposing threat to anything that encountered it. Discluding the creatures we've already mentioned, many species of fish served as a bountiful food source for the area's megafaunal predators. Several species of pycnodont fish swam alongside the aforementioned sharptooth and codus, but the real star of the Piscine show was Stratodus, a gigantic, slender ray-fin predator, 5 meters in length. It went on to actually survive the end Cretaceous mass extinction, thriving in the relatively empty seas at the beginning of the Cenozoic era, where it, alongside select species of shark, would have dominated the ecosystem in the absence of marine reptiles. Sharks were exceptionally abundant in the basin, but only 3 genera coexisted with Thalassotitan in the Maastrichtian. Ceratolamna, a small, sharp-toothed piscivore; Cretolamna, a potential ancestor of Otodus megalodon; and Squalicorax, who we met at the beginning of the video. Close relatives of the sharks were the skates and rays that could be found in the same areas as Thalassotitan. These included genera such as Schizorhiza, Rhombotus, and Cupotesia. Next, let's explore the Oulad Abdoun Basin's reptiles. Ocepasuchus is the sole crocodilian that has emerged from the sediments and represents Africa's earliest known true crocodilian, which was closely related to modern-day gharials. It would have lounged on the beaches surrounding the seas and would have perhaps dipped into the ocean itself to pursue fish or small reptiles. 2 species of marine turtle coexisted with Thalassotitan under these ancient waves too. the bizarre Alienochelis, a turtle related to modern-day leatherbacks that used its crushing jaw to break into shellfish, and Ocephalon, a gigantic species of prostegid turtle with a nearly meter-long skull that would have aided in sucking small fish and invertebrates into its narrow jaws. Above the waves and on the cliffs and coastlines surrounding the seas flew several species of pterosaur. Aside from the aforementioned Barbaridactylus, a lucky time traveler could have encountered Alcyone and Cymurgia, which lived similar lives to modern seabirds, the majestic Tethy Draco, and the giant Asdarchids, Phosphato Draco, and perhaps Aramborgiania. Seeing these aerial reptilian colossi soaring across the open seas surely would have been one of the most awesome sights in all of prehistory. Some dinosaurs have been unearthed from the basin. Ajnabia, a small Lambeosaurine hadrosaur, may have paraded along the shoreline in small herds, where it needed to be wary of Chenanisaurus, a predatory abelosaurid related to the likes of Majungasaurus and Carnotaurus. It is entirely possible that encounters between these species and Thalassotitan could have taken place, as the dinosaurs paddled across the water in search of new territories, or to migrate. One more dinosaur, yet to be fully described however, existed in the basin. A mysterious species of Titanosaur, one of the gigantic sauropods that towered above all other organisms in the Cretaceous period. Time will tell with this species, and hopefully we can soon learn more about it. Southern Mongolia, 70 million years ago. A vast river delta stretches out as far as the eye can see, the occasional tree projecting up into the air, shattering this otherwise level landscape. In the distance, you can see conifer forests, which are marked by dark green clumps of vegetation on the far side of the delta. Compact vegetation lines the riverbanks, and between them, wide, murky stretches of river spread out in a maze of directions. A thick cloud of black flies buzzes over the surface of the water, occasionally dissipated by the swift flash of a brightly colored bird or two. A pair of Taviornis, Cretaceous birds perhaps related to geese and ducks, waddled by the riverbank, emerging from the dense vegetation to dabble in the shallow water. At the base of a nearby tree, a small dinosaur, the troodontid Zanabazar, scurries out of the undergrowth, ensnaring a small reptile in its sharp teeth. In the distance, you can make out a vast herd of various species of herbivorous dinosaur. A large group of Gallimimus is separated occasionally by a large Saurolophus, while the huge figures of the Titanosaur sauropod, Nemegtosaurus, loom in the background. The true star of these murky wetland swamps, a creature stranger than fiction, is yet to reveal itself, however. A thunderous bubbling from the deepest section of this stretch of river betrays the presence of a very large animal, and soon after, a large feather-covered hump slowly rises from the water, dripping with muddy river water and covered in green pondweed. The creature is plainly a dinosaur, but you might not instantly recognize it as one. When it is stood up, the river water is waist height on this animal, which walks on two powerful legs and possesses a pair of long, grasping arms, which, in this individual, sits a huge clump of pondweed. Atop its long neck sits a truly bizarre head, tipped with a long, flat, duck-like bill, measuring 10 meters in length from nose to tail, and over 3 meters in height up to its hump. This is Deinocheirus, a giant herbivorous theropod. In its mouth is a thick cluster of vegetation, pulled up from the bed of the slow-moving river. The creature grunts, appearing vaguely disinterested by your presence, before resuming its morning feeding session in the river. From further on down the river, several more Deinocheirus are making their presence known. Large adult females with hatchlings wander down to the riverbank to drink, while large males feed on the abundant aquatic plant life of this lush green land. Deinocheirus really is a bizarre specimen, even for a time and place where many species of dinosaur were blossoming out into bizarre new forms. Here we have a giant feathered theropod, adapted to a herbivorous lifestyle in the wetlands that would one day become the dry, barren Gobi Desert. The strangest feature of this dinosaur is without a doubt its bill. Round and flat, this bill would have acted very much like that of a modern-day duck or goose, allowing it to easily feed on the dense clumps of vegetation growing within and beside the rivers it calls home. This beak would have been covered in keratin, the same substance that makes up our very own fingernails and hair, and would have been tough. It is proposed that this dinosaur may have supplemented its herbivorous diet with a small helping of meat here and there, perhaps snapping up small vertebrates, such as fish, from the rivers it wallowed in. Traveling down the neck and towards the arms, we can see that Deinocheirus is the owner of some impressive forelimbs indeed. Next to Therizinosaurus, the strange long-clawed theropod, also native to Cretaceous Mongolia, Deinocheirus possessed the longest forelimbs of any known bipedal dinosaur. These limbs each measured a massive 2.5 meters in length, and they were backed up by immense muscles. Scientists have been able to deduce that from various impressions and grooves in the arm bones, that this would have been a very strong dinosaur, perhaps capable of defending itself from large predators or bringing food sources into its mouth to eat. 3 claw-tipped fingers of equal lengths tipped each limb, which were likely used to rake the bottom of the rivers, allowing vegetation to be dug up and eaten. The torso of the dinosaur, despite being used to support a very powerful muscular animal, was relatively narrow and lightweight. Scientists have proposed that the vertebrae bones would have been supported by air sacs, allowing the giant animal to decrease its weight, helping it get around much easier than if it was bearing its full weight at all times. The pelvis of the dinosaur was much larger than that of its contemporaries, to allow it to support its 2 powerful legs beneath it. A long tapering tail rounded off the dinosaur, supporting the dinosaur in terms of balance, ensuring that it did not topple over forwards from being too top-heavy. Interestingly, Deinocheirus and its relatives are known to have been coated in a layer of pennaceous feathers, meaning that a stalk or quill was present running down the center of each, much like many modern birds. This could mean that the dinosaur's tail could have ended in a fan of feathers, which may have been used for display purposes. As many of Deinocheirus' relatives, the ornithomimids, were known to have had wing-like arrangements of feathers on the forearms, it is likely that this dinosaur may have also possessed similar structures, which would have made for a striking appearance in life. It is, of course, possible that some of the dinosaur's feathers may have been brightly colored in order to attract a mate, or to ward off predators and rival males. Scientists at this time still remain unsure about the exact color of Deinocheirus, as no sufficient evidence has been found to reveal this information. Due to its strange form and bizarre lifestyle, Deinocheirus has managed to find its way into popular media several times and has inspired interest and wonder amongst dinosaur fans for many years. The 2019 Japanese documentary, Amazing Dino World, made by NHK and CuriosityStream, was the first to publicize this dinosaur in its true form amongst popular media. In the show, it was portrayed as a gigantic pink and red spoonbill or flamingo-like animal, draped in vibrant shades of blue and white throughout its plumage. The series was praised for introducing lesser-known dinosaurs into the public eye, but it has been stated that it would be unlikely for Deinocheirus to possess this extremely colorful plumage pattern, as it would have made it very difficult for the dinosaur to evade detection from predators against the lush green backdrops of the Mongolian Nemegt River basin. In the series, Deinocheirus is depicted as a fierce defender of its hatchlings, guarding itself in combat from the giant Tyrannosaur Tarbosaurus. Deinocheirus was also depicted very recently in the 2022 Apple TV documentary Prehistoric Planet, narrated by David Attenborough. The series was praised as one of the best dinosaur documentaries ever made, due to its hyper-realistic representation of many familiar and obscure species of dinosaur throughout the end of the Cretaceous period. Deinocheirus was depicted in its humid riverine habitat, wading through a deep section of river and pulling vegetation up from the murky depths with its long arms to feed. The dinosaur was shown being mobbed by large clouds of biting insects, which was causing it a great deal of irritation and pain. To combat this, the Deinocheirus individual in the show was shown rubbing up against a tree, using it as a scratching post, much like a modern-day large mammal, in order to target the areas its long arms could not scratch. The dinosaur in Prehistoric Planet was a much more believable black and brown colored, which blended in effectively against the dark shades of the river and deep greens of the surrounding plant life. A blue stripe of color was added towards the dinosaur's face, which would have potentially been used for display or intimidation. Speaking of Deinocheirus' fossil specimens, they are unfortunately rather few and far between. To this date, we only have 3 specimens of the giant theropod, and they have been the subject of much mystery, wonder, and debate over the decades, since it was first unearthed and described in July of 1965. It was Zofia Kielin-Jaworowska, a Polish paleontologist, that discovered the first remains of the mighty Deinocheirus at the Altan Ula 3 dig site in the Nemegt Formation in the middle of Mongolia's Gobi Desert. The first Deinocheirus fossils to be found were located on a small sandstone hill and didn't tell us too much about the creature's overall appearance. The fossils consisted of 2 complete arms and shoulders, minus the right hand's claws, as well as some vertebrae and ribs. Look back on an old dinosaur book from your childhood, and you may well find a now outdated section depicting Deinocheirus' colossal arms, with some mysterious text explaining that we don't know what the dinosaur looked like as a whole in real life. As a result of these huge arms, many books and scientific papers of days gone by would often refer to the find as one of the most bizarre in all paleontology. What did this dinosaur look like in real life? The dinosaur was determined to belong to a whole new family of theropod dinosaurs, as nothing like it had been found since. It really was a fantastic discovery. The creature was named Deinocheirus mirificus, which translates from Greek and Latin respectively as unusual horrible hand. as a result of the immense size and power of the dinosaur's limbs. Deinocheirus would remain cloaked in mystery and wonder for many years, until more specimens were finally announced in 2013. These discoveries were first announced in 2013 and were officially described in 2014. Scientists had dug up additional specimens of Deinocheirus as part of the 2006 Korea-Mongolia International Dinosaur Expedition. In the exact same site, the holotype fossil was discovered in 1965. Subsequently, in 2009, another specimen was dug up, a bit bigger than the holotype. Scientists determined that, due to the shape and form of the forearms, this was definitely another Deinocheirus specimen. But both finds had been damaged by fossil poachers, making it harder for scientists to work on them. This was likely a more complete specimen, but the poachers had taken the skull and much of the postcranial skeleton. This was still a big deal for scientists. There was a lot of new information here to deduce about Deinocheirus and the way it might have lived. Once these specimens were announced, rumor had it that there was a suspected Deinocheirus skull floating around the European black market, which had been spotted by French fossil trader François Escuyer. He managed to obtain the fossils for himself and notified paleontologists. These fossilized remains consisted of a skull, hands, and feet, which had been dug up in the same location as the previous specimens by poachers, before being passed around buyers in Japan and Germany. The fossils were donated to the Royal Belgian Institute for Natural Scientists, where scientists were able to deduce that the fossils belonged to the existing specimen of Deinocheirus due to the size and color of the bones. When put together, and taking into consideration the other specimens of Deinocheirus that have been dug up, scientists now have what is essentially a complete idea of what the giant theropod looked like, and the end result could never have been predicted. Here we had a colossal, sail-backed, duck-billed dinosaur that was adapted to a life in humid river basins, in an area that would one day become a dry, barren desert. This dinosaur was part of a wider lineage that would contain giant carnivores, but this specimen subsisted largely on plant matter. Real life can often be stranger than fiction, it would seem. As discussed at the beginning of the video, the area that would one day become the Nemegt Fossil Formation has not always been as deserted as it is today. 70 million years ago, in the late Cretaceous period, the area was a large, humid river basin and supported a great variety of life that inhabited the area alongside Deinocheirus. The areas of the basin that weren't covered in river were likely marshy wetlands, which spread out for miles across great floodplains. Occasionally, large lakes were formed at the tips of the rivers, which would have supported a massive variety of life. Think of the modern-day diversity that can be found in a wetland, river, or lake wherever you are in the world. This would have been very similar. The landscape of the time was also scattered with thick areas of trees, specifically conifers. Combined, these varying biomes provided so many food sources for the creatures of the late Cretaceous of Mongolia, enough to sustain many species of dinosaur. But who else lived alongside Deinocheirus in the Nemegt? How did our ornithomimid interact with its fellow river dwellers? Firstly, Deinocheirus was not the only ornithomimid dinosaur present in the area at the time, but it was by far the largest. In the nearby woodlands, and on the vast swaths of floodplain, would have strode large herds of Gallimimus, a famous, speedy, ostrich-like dinosaur. Gallimimus was a relatively common sight on the late Cretaceous Mongolian floodplains, and scientists have stumbled upon many near-complete specimens in their excavations. Alongside Deinocheirus, the most spectacular sight of the Nemegt would have been a solitary Therizinosaurus making its way through the conifer forests, perhaps coming down to the river to drink, and sharing a brief momentary interaction with a small herd of Deinocheirus. This gigantic herbivore actually resembled, albeit superficially, a Deinocheirus, and was another species of gigantic herbivorous theropod. This creature was as tall as a giraffe and possessed 3 long, formidable claws on each hand. Sprinting between the herds of ornithomimids in the forests may have been pairs of small oviraptorids known as Ovimimus. These diminutive feathered theropods would have darted through the forest, perhaps picking off plant matter and insects from the conifers. Wait for night to fall on the Nemegt, however, and you might be lucky enough to catch a glimpse of several more sinister creatures. Small packs of Tokisaurus, a type of troodontid, burst from the trees to catch small nocturnal mammals and reptiles that make their homes amongst the conifers. The top predators of the Nemegt, and almost certainly the biggest danger to Deinocheirus on the floodplains, was the Tyrannosaur Tarbosaurus. Deinocheirus arms have been found to have Tarbosaurus-inflicted bite marks on them, indicating that this 4-ton predator may have been able to make a hearty meal out of smaller or weaker individuals. These apex predators would have had a keen sense of smell, being able to locate potential prey items from a long distance. Alongside it, preying on small creatures, would have lived the Tyrannosaur Bagaratin, which measured between 3 and 4 meters in length. This creature would have picked off the smaller ornithomimids perhaps, and maybe even hatchling Deinocheiruses. A run-in with an adult would have put a swift end to an assailing Bagaratin, however. It wasn't just the theropod dinosaurs that made a living from the abundant Nemegt Basin, however. Many other familiar groups of dinosaur had their own Mongolian representatives in the lush, humid wetland. Barsboldia and Saurolophus were 2 large species of Nemegt hadrosaurs, the latter almost matching Deinocheirus in size. Homalocephali and Prenocephali were 2 genuses of Pachycephalosaur native to the time and region, which may have lived in family groups out on the plains. Towering above all else in the Nemegt River Basin was the gigantic sauropod known from the region, a 12-meter giant named Nemegtosaurus. This giant titanosaur would have roamed the lands in herds, feeding on the vegetation at the tops of the conifer trees that few other dinosaurs would have been able to reach. Many species of non-dinosaurian reptile also made the Nemegt Basin their home, living alongside our Deinocheirus. Soaring high above the rivers and lakes below, casting a huge black shadow on the ground, was an unnamed species of Azhdarchid pterosaur, a creature from the same group of flying giants that contains the mighty Quetzalcoatlus and Hatzegopteryx. Still yet to be given an official name, or to be placed within an existing genus, this creature is known only from a few scattered fragments of neck vertebrae bones. And from this, scientists believe that it could have reached sizes of between 10 to 12 meters in length from wingtip to wingtip. For the time being, this creature has been given the intimidating nickname, the Mongol Giant. Back at water level, perhaps weaving in and out of Deinocheirus' long, powerful hind limbs to catch fish and small reptiles, was a crocodilomorph, a creature known as paralligator. This creature would have resembled a modern-day crocodile, a perfectly designed ambush predator that would lay in wait for prey to unknowingly pass by before meeting a swift and efficient end in trap-like jaws. Paralligator's diet may also have included many of the turtle species that shared the waters with both it and Deinocheirus. Many fragments of shells and bone have been discovered from nearby fossil beds that point to the presence of both aquatic and terrestrial turtles in the region. A lot of these species were small and unobtrusive, and would have resembled many species of turtle found in the waterways and lakes of modern-day Asia, as they drifted through the freshwater vegetation, snapping up fish and invertebrates. Although it wasn't a reptile, one species of small amphibian has also been unearthed from the Namek Formation. Altanulia was a tiny aquatic tetrapod, an amphibian that resembled a modern-day newt or salamander, only a few centimeters in length. These creatures would have drifted through the water, congregating in large numbers as they picked off ostracods and other invertebrates from the dark, muddy water. Deep in the murky waters of the Namek River basin swam a whole host of fish, from the small creatures that were possibly fed on by Deinocheirus to supplement its diet, to much larger, stranger creatures. In fact, vertebrae and scales of a bony fish, perhaps related to modern-day coelacanths, lungfishes, or sturgeons, have been found within one of the specimens of Deinocheirus that have been found in the region. One of the more peculiar species of fish that swam in these waters was a creature named Herinaechthys, which would have been a large species of strange, bony fish, related to modern-day Arapimus. The Arapaima is a very large species of freshwater fish native to the Amazon River, where it can be one of the most dangerous creatures in the ecosystem. Little is known about Herinaechthys, but this could have potentially been an unexpected, unseen danger to creatures swimming in or crossing the river and lakes of the Namek Basin. Supporting so many of these creatures were a wide variety of ostracods, tiny freshwater crustaceans that would have floated in the water, picking off tiny specks of food. Nearly 40 different species of ostracod have been found in fossils from the Namek Formation, indicating that they were a very common presence in the water and would have provided basic food for many of the region's animals. To top it off, the plant life of the region was diverse and plentiful. The Namek Formation was a green and verdant land, abundant in lush vegetation to support a wide range of massive herbivorous dinosaurs. The conifer forests provided shelter and food for the terrestrial creatures that roam the land. But there is plenty of evidence within those forests that other food sources were available, such as sporophyll plants, which were likely numerous on the floodplains and forest floor, providing food for many herbivorous dinosaurs. In the lakes and rivers, and likely providing the main food source for Deinocheirus, were various species of pondweed. Deinocheirus would have dragged these plants up from the sediment and the riverbanks in great quantities. This food must have been readily available to sustain a species of such large herbivore in an area inhabited by many similar creatures. The surface of the water was also coated in flowering aquatic plants known as duckweeds or water lentils, whose fruits and leaves would have provided additional food for these gigantic theropod dinosaurs. Deinocheirus has been placed in the family Deinocheiridae, which is one particular family of animals in the wider Ornithomimosaur grouping. When Deinocheirus was discovered, it was so unlike any other theropod dinosaur discovered thus far that it was given its own taxonomic family to distinguish it from other theropod groupings. This was all down to the bizarre arm structure. Nothing like it was known at this point. Several other dinosaurs accompany Deinocheirus in the family. In Asia, the Chinese Beishanlong and the Mongolian Gerudomimus. Despite the fact that all three of these dinosaurs lived throughout the Cretaceous, none of them would have ever encountered each other. Beishanlong was the earliest, which went extinct 100 million years ago. Gerudomimus came next, appearing on the scene 98 million years ago, and going extinct 83 million years ago. And the final known member was our gigantic Deinocheirus, which existed from 71 to 69 million years ago. In Mexico, meanwhile, on the other side of the world, lived Paraxenosaurus, which existed from 71 to 73 million years ago. It was also a Deinocheirid and resembled Deinocheirus rather closely. This dinosaur was very closely related to Deinocheirus, in fact, and would have evolved from a common ancestor at a time when North America and Asia were connected. The continents eventually would drift apart, and the lineage would evolve into Deinocheirus and its Asian contemporaries, whilst the North American lineage would become Paraxenosaurus. A similar process can be seen in modern-day marsupials. Typically, we associate Australia with this group of pouched mammals, but various species are present in South America too. These creatures are echoes from a time when the two continents were not separated by a huge oceanic barrier. But what did these creatures look like? Let's start by taking a look at Paraxenosaurus, the Mexican Deinocheirid. Smaller than Deinocheirus, this creature would still have been a very impressive sight in its coastal plain habitat. It measured just short of 6 meters in length and looked like a smaller, more slender Deinocheirus, still covered in a layer of shaggy feathers. This dinosaur lacked the huge, hump-like spinal sail possessed by its cousin and would have shared the area with various species of ceratopsian, hadrosaur, and ornithomimid dinosaurs. Gerudomimus, Deinocheirus' Mongolian relative, was smaller and more slender still. It bore an appearance much more similar to classic ornithomimid dinosaurs, such as Gallimimus or Struthiomimus. Again covered in a thick layer of feathers, this was an ostrich-like dinosaur, 4 meters in length from nose to tail, that would have been capable of great speeds, as it congregated in herds across the semi-arid river basins of Cretaceous Mongolia. Gerudomimus was dug up in the Bayan Shire Formation of Mongolia, an area famed for its great diversity of dinosaur life. Alongside this relatively little Deinocheirid would have lived Electrosaurus, Graciloceratops, and Segnosaurus, among many others. Finally, let's take a look at Beishanlong, the earliest, most basal Deinocheirid dinosaur, which was discovered in the early Cretaceous rocks of China. Despite measuring a little over 2 meters tall in height, this was a very large dinosaur, and its tapering, slender form would have stretched to over 6 meters in length from nose to tail tip. It resembled something between the stereotypical ornithomimosaur form and the bizarre Deinocheirid form, bearing an uncanny appearance to both types of dinosaur. Like Deinocheirus, this was a robust, strong animal with long arms and large muscles. The dinosaur was named in 2009
And in the description of the dinosaur, it was noted that it was already of considerable size and was still growing at the time it died. This creature likely inhabited forested wetlands and river systems that ran through ancient China, leading an omnivorous lifestyle of feeding on plant matter and small invertebrates. The closest relation to the Dinochirids, outside of the ornithomimid dinosaurs, are the Maniraptorans, a huge clade of theropod dinosaurs, which include all of the classic raptor dinosaurs and more. In this group can be found such well-known and classic groups such as the Dromaeosaurs, Therizinosaurs, Oviraptorosaurs, Alvarezsaurs, Troodontids, and all modern-day birds. It is not currently known why exactly Deinocheirus disappeared from this world, eventually becoming extinct. We do know that Deinocheirus became extinct roughly around 69 million years ago, not too long relatively before the eventual extinction of all non-avian dinosaurs. In situations like these, we can only speculate. Perhaps natural disasters took their toll on the species, or perhaps the food sources that Deinocheirus relied upon disappeared due to the climate changes toward the end of the Cretaceous period. Climate change may have also resulted in the loss of the riverine habitat that Deinocheirus relied so heavily upon to find food. Or perhaps it could just not adapt to other changing features within the environment. It is a mystery that may one day perhaps be resolved by science. But until then, we can only wonder what happened to these great creatures of the vast Mongolian floodplains. Picture the scene. You're stood on a damp floodplain, stretching miles into the distance. Below your feet, shallow puddles of water have spilled out onto the flat, low-lying river basin, which surrounds the immediate area. Thick, boggy marshland is abundant. Straight ahead, a slow-moving river snakes through the land, producing the muddy wetlands that characterize the landscape. The river lies in the shadow of distant peaks that emerge over the horizon, piercing the clouds that fill the gray, overcast sky of the early Cretaceous of Niger, Africa. Several meters behind you lie sparsely forested open woodlands, from which the chirping of insects can be heard, as well as the odd pterosaur. A small lizard scurries onto a rock a few feet away, and noticing your presence, immediately shifts off in the opposite direction to find a clearer spot to relax. A large herd of Lyrtosaurus, a genus of heavy-built, long-necked iguanodont, has now emerged from the trees to drink from the reliable water supply that dominates the landscape. The gruff, mumbling calls of the herbivores, now abruptly overpowering the soundscape. Between the dinosaurs and the commotion kicked up in the marshland between them, you notice an individual that doesn't look quite right. Shorter at the shoulder, broader, and with the majority of its length composed of its neck and tail. It's plainly a sauropod, completely unrelated to Lyrtosaurus, but it's roughly the same size as them, at around 9 meters in length. This is abnormally small for a sauropod. The group of long-necked, often giant dinosaurs, which included creatures such as Brachiosaurus and Diplodocus. Even so, it's still very big when it's standing this close to you. The strange creature rears its head to check that the coast is clear of predators, and snorts a brief grunt of satisfaction from its nose and mouth, particles of sand gracing the humid afternoon air as it does so. Lowering its thick, extended neck to the water, it takes a long, deep drink. This is Nigersaurus, one of the most amazing dinosaur discoveries of the entire African continent. Nigersaurus, meaning Niger lizard, or rather lizard from Niger, is a species of relatively small Robacosaurid sauropod dinosaur, which was discovered in 1976, but wasn't officially named until 1999. Eventually, in 1999, it was given the species name Nigersaurus taqueti, after its discoverer, French paleontologist Philippe Taquet, who only actually discovered a few bones at the time. Thankfully, now we have a much better understanding of what this creature looked like. Despite the fact that this dinosaur was discovered over 40 years ago, paleontologists didn't really get a good understanding of what the creature may have looked like in life until the end of the 2000s. Very recently, in terms of scientific understanding, this was due largely to the lack of fossils discovered from the creature that were in good enough condition to reliably study. When well-preserved specimens did begin to show up, it was possible for scientists to discern just what it was they had found and why it was so special. Moreover, Nigersaurus is now the second most abundant herbivore of the area and time, second only to the aforementioned Lurdosaurus. The dinosaur was named and described by paleontologist Paul Sereno, who subsequently spent a lot of time in the field, excavating and studying the prehistoric creatures of the Earl Hatz Formation of Niger, Africa, where Nigersaurus was discovered. Sereno is credited with discovering almost complete fossil specimens of Nigersaurus, which have aided immensely in allowing paleontologists and paleoartists to get a better understanding of what this creature may have looked like and how it lived, allowing for very accurate reconstructions of the animal. As it stands, at the time this video is being recorded, we are just missing a few bones from the animal, just a few from the ribs and vertebrae. Perhaps these will show up in future excavations of the region, allowing us to complete the fossils of this marvelous creature. Paul Sereno even kept an amazing field journal of his discoveries that would prove to not only Paul, but the wider paleontology community to be very, very fruitful indeed. An excerpt from his journal reads, September 9th, 2000. Our first week in the field has been spectacular. Remarkable discoveries seem to be waiting for us around every dune. On our first day, we found bones of the long-necked dinosaur Nigersaurus. Nigersaurus, you might remember, we named for bones collected on the last expedition here 3 years ago. This sauropod, long-necked dinosaur, has an unusual skull, containing as many as 500 slender teeth. A major goal of this expedition is to find the rest of this unusual dinosaur, so we can describe it and reconstruct it for everyone to see. Sereno was justly rewarded with his study, as he continued. We are closing in on that goal fast, because we came upon a skeleton a few days later. This skeleton is lying on its side, with the tail curved upward. The curve of the backbone measures about 15 feet. We carefully brushed the sand off the 110 million-year-old bones and dug channels between the major areas of the skeleton. Soon we will cover each area in plaster so that the skeleton can be transported out of the field and back to the laboratory. Sereno's work has provided us with much that we know about this creature, which would prove to be much stranger than what initially met the eye. Nigersaurus was not built like your average sauropod. Proportionally, the animal had a much shorter neck than that of its cousins, but it was still long enough to obviously distinguish it as a sauropod. It stood at just over 2 meters tall and 9 meters long, which, again, separated it from many of its colossal relatives, some of which were capable of reaching over 20 gargantuan meters in length, similar in size to the mighty blue whale, the largest animal that has ever lived. The 4-ton dinosaur walked with its neck and tail held horizontally at each end of the body.
instead of raising it high up like Brachiosaurus, each end providing an effective counterbalance for the other. The strangest feature of Nigersaurus, however, can be found within its jaws, specifically its teeth, all 500 of them. You heard that right, 500. After its discovery in 2007, Paul Sereno proclaimed it as one of the weirdest dinosaurs he had ever seen, comparing its mouth to a vacuum cleaner. Nigersaurus's teeth were tiny, packed tightly together within a wide, flat mouth that was indeed very much like the end of a vacuum cleaner. The teeth were in fact stacked vertically, above and below each other, within the top and bottom jaws respectively. The dinosaur is believed to have had, at any one time, 60 teeth on its top jaw and 68 teeth on the bottom. These teeth were expected to last around 2 weeks before falling out, meaning that Nigersaurus constantly needed a fresh supply. Enter the additional layers. As soon as a tooth was ejected from the mouth, a fresh one would shortly emerge to take its place from the other layers, ensuring that the dinosaur was able to constantly, effectively scrape ground-level plant matter from the plentiful vegetation that would have filled the forests and marshlands of Niger around 120 million years ago. It is Nigersaurus's habit of feasting on ground-level vegetation that has seen scientists dub it with the nickname, the Mesozoic cow. Much like a modern-day bovine, Nigersaurus would have used its wide, flat snout and the tiny scraping teeth within to shred plant matter from the branches of the plants closest to the ground, perhaps the ones that were growing around the waterline of the floodplain it inhabited. The dinosaur's bizarre dental arrangements have also seen it break a pretty obscure record. Its teeth are positioned further forward in its skull than any other tetrapod that has ever lived. These teeth are also unique among sauropod dinosaurs. Surprisingly, no other sauropod dinosaur has yet been unearthed with such strange battery-like tooth reserves. Due to the positioning of the mouth and the structure of the skull, it was unlikely that this dinosaur would have been able to open its mouth very wide at all, only able to open its jaws wide enough to fit in the necessary plant matter and water, sucking the nutrients up towards its lengthy digestive system. We mentioned before that Nigersaurus adopted a horizontal stance, but this may or may not be entirely accurate. There is much scientific debate surrounding the exact stance this dinosaur preferred to habitually adopt, much of this stemming from the animal's neck vertebrae. The original argument stated that Nigersaurus kept its neck held at a 67-degree downward angle so it could easily feed on low-growing shrubbery and vegetation, but analysis of the neck bones have raised the idea that the neck may have been much more flexible than we first imagined. The jury is still out on this one, but many popular depictions of Nigersaurus tend to favor the former stance as gospel, showing a creature that held its head low as it slowly ambled through the early Cretaceous floodplains of Niger. Another notable bizarre feature of Nigersaurus is the nature of its skull. As well as being the only fossil discovered so far, which features jawbones wider than the actual skull itself, the skull in its entirety was very lightweight and delicate. Only a single centimeter of bone connected the animal's muzzle to the back of its skull, and this bone was only around 2 millimeters thick. Some of these bones were so thin they were almost transparent, allowing sunlight to pass straight through them. This gives us some insight as to why it took paleontologists so long to discover reliable specimens of the dinosaur. If the bones were this lightweight, thin, and delicate, it's no wonder they were so difficult for scientists to unearth without completely destroying them in the process. Judging by studies performed on the cranial bones of Nigersaurus, it can even be determined that this dinosaur was probably of average intelligence, possessing a brain-to-body mass ratio which was completely average for a reptile. The theropods and ornithischians it shared the floodplains and forests with were likely slightly more intelligent. But the cerebrum of the dinosaur makes up about 30% of the entire brain, indicating that the creature was neither fool or a genius. The eye sockets of Nigersaurus's skull were also proportionally much larger than the average sauropod dinosaur. And a good theory as to why this might have been loops us back around to the argument about the dinosaur's stance and feeding habits. If Nigersaurus did spend the majority of its time with its head held low, grazing from the low-growing vegetation like a large reptilian cow, it needed to be cautious. It shared the area with numerous large theropod dinosaurs, more on them later, and it needed to be able to see them coming. To compensate for the time spent with its head held down low, it has been theorized that Nigersaurus may have had excellent eyesight, able to view approaching danger from a wide radius as it was feeding at ground level. It is also well worth paying attention to the dinosaur's nose, or rather, what evolution bothered keeping of it. Perhaps due to its good eyesight and reliance on its vision, the dinosaur's sense of smell had diminished greatly, as was revealed upon completing a study of the creature's brain cavity. It retained the deep, long nostrils of many sauropod species, but the olfactory lobes, the features of the nasal area that determine how well an animal can smell, were greatly diminished. Serino also made a point of discussing observations in Nigersaurus's peculiar spine, touring the skeleton, and explaining it in an article with NPR in 2007. He said, "The animal is about 30 feet long, and we are standing at the base of the neck that rises above our heads. And when you see the vertebrae in front of us, there's more air in each one of these vertebrae, in the neck and in the back, than there is bone." Many sauropods, such as Nigersaurus, would have had their bodies lined with air sacs in order to keep themselves more lightweight, reducing the pressures of their massive frames. Nigersaurus was no different, representing an animal that, for its size, was almost outlandishly lightweight. Finally, we come to the dinosaur's tail. This structure was extremely long in some sauropods, and Nigersaurus was the proud owner of a formidable weapon at the end of its tail. When threatened with attack from one of the region's large carnivorous theropod dinosaurs, Nigersaurus, very similar to Diplodocus, would have been able to swing and crack its tail like a whip, wounding or off-putting its assailant. It surely would have been an intimidating sight to see herds of Nigersaurus defending themselves from attack, swinging their tails in elaborate intimidation displays to make themselves look larger or more threatening. Nigersaurus fossils have been dug up in what is now the Earlhats Formation, a strata of rocks in the Tenere Desert of modern Niger. Although the area today is hot and barren, millions of years ago, when Nigersaurus roamed the earth, a vast river ran through the area, creating the aforementioned floodplain. The specimens of Nigersaurus that scientists have unearthed from the region likely died and fell into this river, or were dragged into it by the floodwater. There, they would have been covered up in layers of sediment and preserved, frozen in time, for humans to come and dig up in the present day. It's not just Nigersaurus that has been unearthed at this site, however. As well as being famous for its dinosaur stock, the Earlhats is well known for its strange species of crocodilian, some of which were very different to the ones you and I recognize today. As Nigersaurus drank from the river, it needed to be wary, especially in the earlier stages of its life, of a creature named Sarcosuchus. Sarcosuchus, whose name literally translates to English as flesh crocodile, was a giant. At 9.5 meters in length, it would have readily taken on many of the Earlhats dinosaurs. And even adult Nigersaurus were fair game for the giant croc. It resembled a gigantic version of today's modern gharials, with a long, winding paddle-like tail and thin, elongated snout. Like modern crocs, it would have laid in wait just below the surface of the water, waiting for an unwary Nigersaurus to appear, before launching itself at the helpless victim. Not all of the Earl Hatt's crocodilians were quite this monstrous, though. Some of them were just downright bizarre, sharing the waterways and riverbanks that sustained our Nigersaurus were the meter-long Araripasuchus and the even smaller Anatosuchus. These were agile crocodilians that walked on elongated, stilt-like limbs, either running after prey or stalking it at the water's edge like a heron. The latter, Anatosuchus, gets its name from the outlandish, flat, duck-like snout it possessed, which will have greatly aided it in its strange feeding methods. It's the dinosaurs that make up the majority of the major Earl Hatt's finds, however, and Nigersaurus had some stiff competition. Aside from Lurdosaurus, the aforementioned iguanodont, the famous Ouranosaurus was present in the area, a peculiar basal hadrosaur with a sail running down along its back and tail. Nigersaurus represents the only known sauropod stock, but at the same size as a few of its contemporaries, it would have likely provided an easy meal for some of the region's top predators. Potentially the region's top predator was a theropod dinosaur known as Cryptops, a large abelosaurid theropod roughly 7 meters from nose to tail. With tiny arms, long legs, and powerful jaws, Cryptops superficially resembled famous predatory dinosaurs such as Carnotaurus or Majungasaurus, and would have been almost as deadly. Capable of bringing down a Nigersaurus on its own, although it could have hunted in small groups or pairs. Eocarcharia is another large carnivore, more than capable of bringing down a Nigersaurus, this time a basal Carcharodontosaurid rather than an abelosaurid. At pretty much the same length as Cryptops, this dinosaur was more slenderly built, with much longer arms. It certainly wasn't an easy place for a young Nigersaurus to grow up. The most famous dinosaur the Earl Hatt's formation has offered up yet is without a doubt Suchomimus, the strange crocodile-like spinosaurid dinosaur that would have waded by the water's edge, snapping up large fish in its long jaws. At 10 meters long, Suchomimus was the region's largest theropod, and while it most likely preyed primarily on fish, it is not out of the question that this creature might have turned to hunting, or at least scavenging, from large dinosaurs, such as Nigersaurus, when the river's stocks weren't providing. The fish preyed upon by Suchomimus may well have included the likes of Mawsonia, however, a gigantic relative of the coelacanths that was well suited to a freshwater existence, thriving in numbers in the waterways of the Earl Hatts, a fish that was also on the menu elsewhere in North Africa for Spinosaurus. Remains of multiple other species have also been unearthed by scientists at the Earl Hatt's formation. A species of pterosaur, which would have flown high above the dramatic scenes below, would have snatched fish from the river that ran through the Earl Hatt's formation, perhaps breeding in large numbers on higher ground. Several species of turtle have been discovered, which would have lived in the shadow of the large dinosaurs as they came down to the water to drink. Most surprisingly, a species of Hybodont, a Mesozoic shark, has also been discovered in the region. This shark would have prowled the riverine waterways, perhaps like a modern-day bull shark occasionally does. Freshwater bivalves would have provided a key food source for many different creatures, which would have lived in abundance at the bottom of the river. As for the flora of the Earl Hatt's formation, the land was dominated by ferns, horsetails, and angiosperms, which were among the most common species of plant at the time. Grass did not evolve until the late Cretaceous, millions of years after Nigersaurus had gone extinct, meaning that these low-growing plant species would have been the food sources that this dinosaur was highly specialized in eating. In the surrounding forests, other species could be found. Conifers and cycads composed the bulk of the wooded areas, towering above Nigersaurus and providing food for the area's taller, more adaptable creatures, such as Lurdosaurus or Ouranosaurus. Aquatic vegetation was also abundant, which would have been an important food source for many river dwellers. Due to the length of Nigersaurus's neck, it would likely have been unable to reach down and grab the vegetation growing at the bottom of the river, remaining earthbound on the side of the bank. Within the wider sauropod group was the family Rabacosauridae, which contained Nigersaurus and its closest known relatives. The family contains 11 known species, the most famous of which is Nigersaurus. Characterized by their stocky, bulky bodies and elongated tails, these sauropods can be found all over the western half of the world, from Argentina to Spain and Niger. Dinosaurs from this family were extant throughout the Cretaceous period, from its early to middle stages, and would likely have shared similar lifestyles. There are even dubious, unconfirmed specimens of potential Rabacosaurs from India, meaning that this may have been a very widespread family. Rabacosaurus, the creature from which the family takes its name, was the first to be identified and placed within the grouping in 1990 by sauropod paleontologist Jack McIntosh. Prior to his classification, the dinosaur was assumed to be a diplodocid, directly related to the iconic Diplodocus, Apatosaurus, and Brontosaurus. It is now understood that the Rabacosaurids, which were later broadened to include Nigersaurus, were instead diplodocomorphs, related to, but not directly, dinosaurs such as Diplodocus. Dinosaur taxonomy can often be a minefield of reshuffling, disagreements, and complications, and scientists are continuously updating and rethinking which dinosaurs should be placed where and for what reason. José Bonaparte, the esteemed Argentine paleontologist that is credited with discovering many famous South American dinosaurs, such as Carnotaurus, Riojasaurus, and Saltosaurus, later officially described the family in 1997, and Rabacosauridae has been filled with the likes of Zapalosaurus, Limisaurus, and Amazonsaurus since, as well as Nigersaurus's closest relatives, Demandosaurus and Tatuinia. Rabacosaurids can be distinguished from diplodocids by their lack of divided neural spine bones, and have much more distinctive teeth than the latter, like the ones found in Nigersaurus. In his 2000 expedition to the Erlhatz Formation in Niger, Paul Sereno also stumbled across hatchling Nigersauruses, otherwise affectionately known as sauropodlids. Lying on a wide, flat area of purple-tinted sandstone was a tiny fossil which clearly resembled a baby sauropod, with Nigersaurus being the only sauropod native to the immediate vicinity. It made sense that this was, without a doubt, a Nigersaurus hatchling. The fossil was a section of skull from the baby dinosaur's upper jaw, and Sereno commented in his journal that the bone was no bigger than a silver dollar. He determined that the sauropodlid was unfortunately less than 1 year old when it died. Perhaps it fell into the river, or was chased into it by a predator, where it was capable of becoming fossilized and preserved for millions of years. We can speculate on how a baby Nigersaurus might have lived the early years of its life. Many sauropod species, especially the diplodocids, gave birth to comparatively tiny hatchlings, laying their eggs in nests which were hidden deep within the wooded regions of the area they inhabited. Sauropod hatchlings were so tiny, as the dinosaurs were lumbered with the physical limitations of carrying and laying an egg. Since the eggs were small, the dinosaurs inside needed to be too. Gregory Erickson, paleontologist at the Florida State University, has extensively studied sauropod growth, determining that some of these creatures may have grown by as much as 14 kilograms a day, feeding on low-lying plant matter in the wooded regions of their respective localities. Pregnant female sauropods, when ready to lay their eggs, would congregate in the forests, digging up sections of the forest floor with their forelimbs in order to create a ditch-like nest to lay their clutches. When the dinosaurs hatched, they would be tiny and vulnerable, so the forest was the best place for them to spend their time, instead of out in the open, with the large theropods and no obvious hiding place to get away from them. The baby dinosaurs would have lived their early stages of life out in the woods away from the parents, relatively safe from harm, barring the smaller predators of the forests, forming creches of hatchling to juvenile age animals to provide safety in numbers. We can speculate that Nigersaurus babies might have been doing the same thing in the woodlands of Cretaceous Africa, banding together to keep themselves from harm. When the dinosaurs grew big enough, they would either form or join herds out on the floodplains with other adults, where suitable food was more plentiful. Larger predators, such as cryptops, would have been hunting out on the floodplains. But with their bulkier adult bodies and herds of adults, the subadult Nigersauruses would have been just as safe. Extinction took place within the dinosaurs for a variety of reasons, some of which the general public don't typically associate with dinosaurs, and scientists believe they have found Nigersauruses. We know from its skull and spine that Nigersaurus was adapted to feeding on the low-growing vegetation of the Earl Hats riverbanks and forests. This dinosaur was, as a result, very specialized for a sauropod, as it would not have been able to reach the higher-growing vegetation enjoyed by taller dinosaurs such as Lurdosaurus. The theory is as follows. As the Cretaceous period progressed, the low-growing vegetation that Nigersaurus was entirely dependent upon began to grow more and more sparsely, meaning that it was more difficult for the dinosaur to find enough food to sustain an entire species. Perhaps new creatures evolved that were able to feed on this particular food source more effectively, resulting in more and more Nigersauruses going hungry as the millennia came and went. Eventually, Nigersaurus would have become critically endangered as a result of its dwindling food supply, and as a result of it not being able to reach or consume the higher vegetation of the region. The last few Nigersauruses unfortunately died out, giving way to more successful lineages of the other species sharing the region with it. For the many species of dinosaur that did not go extinct as a result of mass extinction, this would have been a similar fate awaiting them. Think of the modern animals that are predicted to go extinct as a result of climate change. Species of quoll, an Australian marsupial, are facing extinction due to the introduction of less specialized invasive species, resulting in them losing their food supplies. Koalas are also vulnerable, as they feed almost exclusively on eucalyptus leaves, which, once in decline, the little arboreal mammals will struggle to sustain themselves on. Life's greatest survivors have always been the generalist, animals that are able to adapt to any situation or circumstance, resistant creatures that can eat many different types of food. Modern creatures that will no doubt prove successful over the Nigersauruses of the modern day are the crows, rats, cockroaches, and raccoons. Creatures that can adapt and survive to many different scenarios. It's hard to imagine
a colossal Brachiosaurus-sized sauropod amongst the wildlife of modern-day Niger. But for something a bit more in line with Nigersaurus, it's not that much of a stretch. When fully grown, Nigersaurus was roughly the same size as a modern-day African elephant, an animal that does indeed inhabit the grasslands and open plains of Niger today. Modern Niger is home to many large megafaunal animals, such as the hippopotamus, West African giraffe, and African buffalo. Perhaps the buffalo is more in line with a modern analog of Nigersaurus, as Nigersaurus was not the biggest herbivore of its time and locality. That honor goes to Lurdosaurus. We can imagine herds of Nigersaurus mixing with and feeding amongst larger herds of Lurdosaurus, perhaps sticking by the larger animals for safety, or to track reliable sources of food and water. After all, Nigersaurus is colloquially referred to as the Mesozoic cow as a result of its grazing behavior. Nigersaurus is a fantastic example that there is more than meets the eye to many different species of dinosaur. At first sight, Nigersaurus is a very nondescript sauropod, often depicted in dull shades of brown and beige. It's not a dinosaur that would draw particular attention to members of the public if they didn't know about the bizarre structural differences and inner workings of this enigma of a dinosaur, which we will no doubt continue to learn about as the years progress. Africa, in particular, has been a hotbed of strange discoveries that have paved the way in modern paleontology. Just look at the likes of Spinosaurus, for example. What else might there be waiting to be discovered about creatures such as Nigersaurus? How little do we know about its fellow Rhebacosaurid relatives that may be of even more extreme interest than this? The answers are, without a doubt, out there, buried beneath the captivating Cretaceous rocks of Africa. Nigersaurus is an amazing example of the sheer diversity of life exhibited in not only dinosaurs as a whole, but the sauropods alone. The classic images of sauropods depict a slow, lumbering, long-necked creature, but Nigersaurus defies that myth. With its short neck, small stature, unique feeding method, and strange skull, Nigersaurus truly is one of the strangest dinosaur discoveries paleontologists have made to date.